looking forward to this.
Rebel Moon Part 2, The Scargiver, opens in much the same way as Rebel Moon Part 1, A Child of Fire. Anthony Hopkins reads a bunch of nonsense to us while we look at a spaceship. The difference here is that the nonsense being read to us is a recap of the events of Part 1. On the far edges of the Motherworld's reach was the small moon of Velt. There a village of humble farmers lived a simple life born of the earth until the shadow of a warship fell upon their fields. The ship's commander, Admiral Noble, demanded more than Velt's village could give. So it was that a woman named Kora and a man named Gunnar set forth from the village to gather warriors to stand against the dreadnought. In an ambush on the floating docks of Gondoval, Kora triumphed over Admiral Noble, leaving his shattered body on the rocky coastline. The victorious warriors returned to Velt to collect their pay. The threat of a dreadnought extinguished, or so they believed.
I fucking hate movies.
Firstly, I find it highly amusing that these movies can't seem to agree on how to pronounce Gunnar.
Gunnar.
I have no idea which is correct. I went with Gunnar in Part 1, so for Part 2, I'll be calling him Gunnar because it is funnier. And secondly, I can't remember the last time I watched a film in which the opening exposition established that the characters have brain damage. There is no reason why any of the characters should believe that the dreadnought no longer poses a threat. The film suggests that because Admiral Noble was killed, or so they believed, they expected that the dreadnought would abandon its mission and return to the Motherworld. I will get back to how little sense this idea makes later, but for now, the point is that even if Kora and her ragtag team of action figures are correct, and the King's Gaze will simply leave, they have to know that they are not safe. Velt is not safe. The farmers are not safe. The Imperium is an intergalactic superpower that blows up planets because they are bored. They will obviously be back and they will obviously kill you. Best case scenario, by removing the threat of the dreadnought, if that is indeed how it works, you have bought yourself a small amount of time. This is one of countless narrative-breaking plot points in Rebel Moon Part 2, The Pain Provider, and any one of them would be a major problem by themselves. And I can only conclude that Zack Snyder sees narrative cohesion as an obstacle rather than as a necessary part of storytelling. After the events of Part 1, Cassius is now the commander of the King's Gaze, as Noble is currently being healed by having Kool-Aid pumped into his circulatory system.
We don't know how bad the damage was. We'll know what's left of him when we bring him out of the chrysalis.
Now, I was kind of expecting them to go somewhere with this. Noble was an unhinged nutbag in Part 1, and because they have decided to reuse the same villain for Part 2, a good way to dial up the stakes could have been to have Noble get resurrected, but have this process not go as planned. Maybe he comes back as some kind of mutant with either physical or mental deformities. Maybe his brain doesn't work properly, and he is even more of a threat than he was in Part 1. Unfortunately, the writers don't even do this. Admiral Noble is absolutely fine. There were no consequences for him dying and coming back. In fact, he seems to have acquired superhuman strength from somewhere. He seemingly has no brain damage, despite having no brain function for quite a while. Yes, that is a line delivered by a space doctor in this film.
He had no brain function for quite a while.
All right.
He is apparently the exact same character as in the previous film. No injuries, nothing screwy going on with his brain, just the same character doing the same thing. Being evil. The King's Gaze has been holding in orbit around Gondoval, and Cassius tells Noble that they have been hoping for his recovery. Implication being that the King's Gaze cannot operate without an admiral, and that had Noble been unrecoverable, Cassius would not have been able to assume command of the ship, and he would not have been able to continue hunting the Blood Axes. Setting aside the fact that Cassius is currently in command of the ship, the King's Gaze would therefore have been protocol-bound to return to the Motherworld, presumably so as to have a new admiral assigned to it, or potentially so that Cassius can be promoted, before coming right back out here to the outer reaches of the Imperium's territory so as to continue their mission. Is this making sense to anyone else, or is this just an unbelievable waste of coal? Yes, coal. I'll address that later. Although I guess the Imperium being so absurdly inefficient does make it marginally more believable that they could run out of food. Anyway, Noble tells Cassius that Kora is on Velt, which he can't know. He knows that is where she was, not where she is. Why would Noble assume that Kora has returned to Velt? He likely thinks that Kora believes he is dead, but even so, returning to Velt would be an extremely risky move, as Velt would obviously be the first place the Imperium would go to look for her. So the fact that Noble honestly believes that Kora would return to Velt means that either Noble thinks Kora wants to be captured, which he has no reason to believe, or that Zack didn't realize that this doesn't make any sense, but he needed Noble to correctly guess Kora's location in order for the plot to happen. Both Kora and Noble seem to be operating under the presumption that if Noble was in fact dead, then it would be totally rational for Kora to return to Velt, as she would believe that it was safe to do so. It is obviously not safe to do so, as I have explained. But fuck me, right, for expecting the characters in Rebel Moon Part 2, The Wound Contributor, to be capable of rational thought. Anyway, Noble orders Cassius to set course for Velt, the reason being that at the end of Part 1, Noble was tasked by Belisarius to capture Kora alive. What Noble needs to do, then, is point his giant fuck-off laser gun at Velt and tell Kora to get in his dropship or everyone dies, at which point the movie is over. This is obviously not what happens, however, because it is extremely difficult for a writer to write a character more intelligent than they themselves are. We then rejoin our heroes as they return to the village, victorious after their defeat of Noble. I would forgive you for not remembering who these characters are, so I will very quickly refresh your memory. We have Kora, the most wanted fugitive in the known universe who is on the run from the Imperium. Gunnar, the farmer who wants to fertilize Kora. And Nemesis, General Titus, Tarak, and the Hamburglar, all of whom share one single character trait. They don't like the Imperium. They were recruited in Part 1 to fight the Imperium, and their promised payment was food.
You still get paid, I presume?
Payment awaits us on Velt.
Luckily, all of them are ideologically opposed to the Imperium, and so none of them require any payment to stick around in this film. Anyway, Hagen and Den take them to the Longhouse, where the villagers have prepared a meal for them, evidently aware that today was the day Kora was coming back. How they knew this?
I have no fucking idea.
Has this food just been sitting here for days or weeks? Did they batch cook it and then reheat it? Sorry, Zack, I'll stop being mean. Anyway, we also see that Sam and Private Aris are chilling in the barn, where last week Sam was almost gang-raped by the rest of Aris's squad. One would think that this would be the last place Sam would want to be, but I guess one would have to have a somewhat less immature understanding of the psychological consequences of sexual violence than Zack Snyder. Sam then tells Aris that Kora has returned with 6 warriors, and I'm unsure why she included Gunnar in that 6, but okay. And Aris then replies,
It won't matter how strong they are, will it?
Which seems like the actor read the wrong line from the script. It would make sense for Sam, the farm girl, to ask Aris, the Imperium soldier, it won't matter how strong they are, will it? Because he knows the strength of the Imperium. He knows what is very likely coming their way. Whereas she only has a very vague idea. Him saying, it won't matter how strong they are, will it, to her, is a nonsense line of dialogue because she knows less than he does. We then get a nice little retcon. In my video covering Part 1, I assumed, quite reasonably I think, that the Imperium had no means by which to contact the garrison of soldiers they had left behind in the village. Because if they did have this capability, then they would very obviously know that something had gone wrong. Rebel Moon Part 2, The Hurt Doer, however, confirms that the Imperium does have a means by which to contact them, which carries with it some hilarious and absurd implications. This means that every time the King's Gaze has tried to contact the squad, Aris has been the one to answer the phone. No other soldiers will have been seen or heard, because all other soldiers are, of course, dead. At no point did the King's Gaze question why Aris, a private, was the only guy ever answering the phone. At no point did the Imperium have any information or orders intended for the sergeant. At no point did the King's Gaze tell Aris, go and get your superior, because had they done this, then it would have become clear that Aris has defected and they have killed the other soldiers, and the King's Gaze would obviously then nuke the village from orbit, bringing a mercifully swift end to the story of Rebel Moon. This could have been a relatively easy fix, although this fix would still rely on an overdose of luck, but I would take an overdose of luck any day over depicting the antagonists of the film as having slapstick levels of brain damage. Had they established in Part 1 that Private Aris is the comms guy, then it would make sense for Private Aris to be the one communicating with the King's gaze. It could then be hand-waved that Noble and Cassius never asked to speak to the Sergeant, because their means of communicating with the Sergeant could well have been through Private Aris, the comms guy. Now, this would, of course, still rely on laughable levels of luck, namely the fact that the only guy in the squad who is not a rapist is the comms guy, but that is still preferable to what we got. What we are expected to believe instead is that Private Aris has spoken with Cassius on at least one occasion, and has pretended that all is going well. The rest of his squad are still totally alive and raping the locals, and he has totally not defected in the name of Bobs and Vagine, thus painting Cassius and the Imperium as having a similar level of intellect to that of a Zack Snyder fan. Speaking of Cassius having a similar level of intellect to that of a Zack Snyder fan, he informs Aris that the King's gaze will be returning to Velt in 5 days' time. What? So the mechanical reason this happens is twofold. The heroes need to be made aware that they are not out of the fight just yet, otherwise they would have had no time to prepare for the arrival of the King's gaze. The plot of this film literally does not happen without Cassius telling Aris that they will be there in 5 days' time. And secondly, it establishes a time frame, a ticking clock, and theoretically, tension. The problem with this, however, is that Cassius was told earlier by Noble that Kora is on Velt, and yet he has decided to phone ahead and warn Velt that they are coming.
Why would you do that?
To be more explicit, the reason why the movie breaks at the 6-minute mark is because if Kora is indeed on Velt, then obviously the garrison of soldiers are all dead. Kora is an extremely skilled fighter who is supposedly ideologically opposed to the Imperium, and I use the word supposedly deliberately, don't worry, I'll get back to this later, and Noble would know this. Kora being on Velt and the Imperium soldiers running around the village raping everyone are two mutually exclusive scenarios. The only way Cassius could believe that the Imperium soldiers are still alive is if he, for some reason, believes that Kora just kind of left the villagers to their fate, which, given Kora's reputation amongst the Imperium, he absolutely would not believe. Maybe Cassius doesn't believe Noble for some reason. Maybe he thinks Noble's brain has been turned into Play-Doh and therefore Noble is wrong about Kora. But we have nothing to support this idea whatsoever. Additionally, if he doesn't believe Noble, then why is he returning to Velt? Additionally, as the saying goes, if there is even a 1% chance that Kora is on Velt, then we have to take it as an absolute certainty. And yet, Cassius phones Aris, doesn't question why Aris is the only guy who ever wants to talk to him, and tells him that the King's gaze will be there in 5 days' time, after being informed by his superior that Kora is already there.
By all accounts, it doesn't make sense.
Also, Anthony Botkins is here. He's a tribesman now with antlers and a cloak. Character development, folks. The heroes arrive at the Longhouse and are presented with food. However, they note that none of the villagers are out and about. I had assumed that maybe the villagers are all slaving away in the fields, desperately trying to meet the grain quota. Turns out, however, they are just embarrassed about being unable to protect their own home.
How would you feel if you had to ask others to lay down their lives for you, if you were not capable of standing to protect your own home?
Now, much like Rebel Moon as a whole, this is retarded because of the immense power imbalance between the villagers and the Imperium. This is not something I could ever understand being embarrassed about. I might be embarrassed if I were unable to beat a 5-year-old in a cage fight, because the obvious presumption would be that I would destroy a 5-year-old in a cage fight. I would not be embarrassed, however, if I were unable to beat Conor McGregor in a cage fight. If I needed to ask someone for help to defeat Conor McGregor, this would not be a slight on my pride. The Imperium is unbelievably vast and powerful. A village of farmers asking for help to defeat them would not be an embarrassment, and to suggest that it is absurd. But if you want to make it so that the villagers are embarrassed, then you can. You just have to do a little bit more work than telling us they are embarrassed. The writers could have established that the village on Velt has a code of honor, and they do have warriors who defend their land. They consider it the highest honor they can attain to die protecting their fellow villagers. When faced with the incomprehensible might of the Imperium, they realized how unbelievably outgunned they are, and considered dying against such laughably overwhelming odds to not be an honorable end. They considered it pointless and a waste of life, as their death would not protect the village against jack shit. Had this been established, then I could maybe accept these village warriors having to swallow some of their pride and ask for help, because they would have existed for generations under the belief that they can defend their people, only to be violently corrected during the events of Part 1. Unfortunately for Zack Snyder, I just made all of this up, and this is not in Rebel Moon. Anyway, let's move on. We have larger fish to fry.
There's always a bigger fish.
And as it happens, nobody need lay down their lives. A defense won't be necessary.
What are you talking about, woman? Kora is like, we beat the baddies, so we win now, yay. Which is as childish and naive an understanding of the world in which she inhabits as is comprehensible. If Gunnar had said this, I would still be like, man, come on, what the fuck? You saw in the previous film that the Imperium is obviously not defeated because you killed one man and blew up one ship. But I could understand what the writers were trying to do, as Gunnar is supposedly more naive than Kora. But Kora having this belief is unforgivable. Kora knows the Imperium's strength. She does justify this moments later by saying that after an admiral is killed, protocol dictates that the ship return to the motherworld immediately, which, if the Imperium is this anal about their rules, at best means that the villagers will have a few weeks before they are vaporized. Kora believes for some reason that the Imperium will just forget about what happened in the previous film, and Kora having this insane and hilarious belief is what allows the plot of Rebel Moon Part 2, The Boo Boo Dispenser, to happen. Anyway, Kora is swiftly corrected in her assertion that the Imperium has no short-term memory, as Aris turns up and tells her that actually, they will be here in 5 days, thereby implying that they do remember what happened in the previous film. General Titus believes that the King's Gaze will disregard protocol and will return to Velt.
There must be more in need of this grain than we could have known.
He believes that Admiral Noble is dead, but Aris has just told him that the King's Gaze will be here in 5 days. Therefore, his assumption is not that Admiral Noble is actually alive. His assumption is that the King's Gaze really needs their food. This doesn't make any sense, and I will wait until later in the video to fully explore why, so for now, let's continue and just accept that the Imperium needs this grain. He who controls the grain controls the universe. Titus tells the villagers, if we do not act quickly, the destruction of your village is all but assured. The grain is our most powerful weapon. Without it, they are liable to blow us out of existence from orbit. If we bring it in fast, we can use it both as a bartering tool and as a shield. So firstly, no. Even if we accept that the Imperium desperately needs this particular village's supply of grain in order to not die, the Imperium will very obviously walk up, take the grain, and then either demand more by a particular date, or the far more likely outcome, given what happened to the garrison of soldiers left behind in the previous film, is that they will nuke them from orbit regardless. Titus tells the villagers that they must harvest their crops in 3 days instead of the usual time frame, stated to be half the time it takes for the moon of Velt to orbit its planet. We have no idea how long this is, but it is evidently substantially longer than 3 days, given the reaction of the villagers. Also, this isn't how crops work. You have to wait for them to grow. Even if you had enough people to physically harvest all of the crops, this can't be done. Saying go and harvest a dickload of crops in 3 days is like saying go and have ritualistic sex and pump out an army of soldiers in 3 days. That isn't how any of this works. If the villagers had said, yeah, it takes about 7 days, then Titus could have said, okay, well, we don't have that long, so we're working through the night on shifts to get this grain harvested in time, then this may have been somewhat believable. But anyway, they harvest all of their food and put it in one place, which means if it is destroyed for whatever reason, the village will have no food for the next season, even if they successfully negotiate with the Imperium. They will all starve to death. So, is it an option to not harvest all of the food and accomplish the same thing? This depends entirely on the blast radius of the weaponry of the King's Gaze. The reason they harvest all of the grain at once is so as to dissuade the King's Gaze from nuking them from orbit. At this point, Titus and the villagers believe that the Imperium is returning to Velt because they really need that grain, and therefore they will not want to blow it up. The cannons on the King's Gaze are rather large, and they are seen to do incredible damage in both movies, and both Titus and Kora would be aware of this as they are ex-Imperium military. This is not a small-yield tactical nuke we're talking about here, this is a big-dick planet-destroying artillery cannon. The Imperium will therefore not be able to fire it at the village, because it will abso-fucking-lutely destroy all of the nearby grain fields, regardless of whether or not they have been harvested. Therefore, spending 3 days frantically harvesting all of the grain so as to put it in one place is at best a waste of precious time, and at worst makes it easier for all of the grain to be destroyed with one carefully placed grenade, thereby condemning the villagers to starving to death. Anyway, Kora and Guna wander off for a little heart-to-heart.
You think they'll learn to trust one another?
They're frightened of outsiders. Trust, I don't know.
I have no idea why they would not, also they don't have any kind of choice. The script said that the villagers were embarrassed, not suspicious, and General Titus did not present himself as at all suspicious during his speech. Kora hopes that the villagers will have the courage to stand and fight, reminding the audience that the premise of this movie is fundamentally broken and does not function within the world it takes place in. They cannot win. And yet, through broken world building and incredible levels of incompetence from both the characters and the writers, they win. Anyway, Guna and Kora tell each other exactly what they are feeling in a raw display of emotion not seen since the Star Wars prequels.
You're so beautiful.
It's only because I'm so in love.
No. No, it's because I'm so in love with you.
So love has blinded you?
You were afraid to die. Everyone is.
I was scared. The most afraid I've ever been in my life.
What was it you were so afraid of?
It was losing you.
And then they kiss, and Kora finally lets Guna slam her ham wallet. Unfortunately for Guna, neither he nor Kora have the required IQ to be able to legally consent to any of this, and he also doesn't really know what he has just done.
Women are devious and destructive.
He has made the rookie error. He has put his dick in crazy. And, 12 minutes into Rebel Moon Part 2, the Ouchie Ouch Saucer, we get our first backstory. Guna asks Kora, "Hello, now that I have planted my seed, would you care to tell me your backstory?" And Kora, naturally, obliges, because of course Zack has absolutely no idea how to inform the audience of his character's motivations and values, other than by having other characters ask them what they are. So, strap in for the third round of Kora's expository diarrhea. Princess Issa, if you recall, was some kind of space Jesus. She exists because shut up and don't think about it. She is a cosmic force for good sent by the universe to make things good again, and given the way this film ends, my guess is that Zack is waiting until Rebel Moon Part 3 to have someone ask Issa what her backstory is, so as to allow him to fully explain it. Anyway, Princess Issa used her fairy dust to steer her father, the king, away from his family's historic warlike tendencies, and she wanted to give the Imperium flowery meadows, rainbow skies, and rivers made of chocolate. Although the king usually dedicates each new dreadnought as they are launched, this time the princess will do so, being her first official act, and she names the ship John Cena.
The ship would be named Peacemaker.
What a joke.
One thing led to another, and the short version is that Belisarius and the other senators shank the royal family. The royal family are, until recently at the very least, assholes, because the Imperium is an evil faction under their rule. The Imperium has existed and expanded under the king's rule and that of his ancestors, and they do very bad stuff in the name of ruling the universe. Only very recently did the Queen give birth to Space Jesus, who then clogged the king's brain with pixie dust and made him into a goodie. All of this is rather fucked from a moral standpoint, and I have no idea which of these characters I should feel empathy for. The writers could have gone for moral ambiguity, where both the king and Belisarius are selfish, amoral pieces of shit, and other people tragically get caught in the crossfire, but instead the writers very clearly want the audience to care about and empathize with the king, despite him being the leader of an extremely bloodthirsty and sadistic intergalactic regime. Before we continue, I need to explore why Belisarius assassinated the royal family. Belisarius said that he would not stand by and watch the princess dismantle the war machine they sacrificed so much for. He wanted to replace the king and continue being all Imperium-y. Given that he is surrounded by about 30 other senators, he was presumably able to convince them that murdering the king for being too nice was a good idea. Maybe this could happen, I have absolutely no idea, because Rebel Moon seems allergic to world building. What are the consequences of this move, politically? Was the king's increasing passivity and reluctance to continue expanding and killing everything that moves causing problems for the health of the Imperium itself? Are there other factions within the setting that become stronger as the Imperium gets weaker? The only other faction in the setting that we are aware of is the Blood Axes, an utterly insignificant threat consisting of about 15 light spaceships piloted by a group of spazzes with exceptionally poor time management skills. To compare this directly to the Warhammer 40,000 setting, the Imperium of Man is constantly battling against heretics, demons, space dwarves, space elf turbo rapists, space robots, space orcs, bugs, cults of bug worshippers, and worst of all, communists. The Imperium of Man is forced by sheer necessity to engage in massive battles on multiple fronts, purely to ensure its own survival. Conversely, we have not had even the slightest hint that this is the case for the Imperium in Rebel Moon. We have absolutely no idea why Belisarius betrays the king. We are simply told that he didn't want the war machine to stop. Is there a financial incentive? Does he want to take over every planet in the universe and tax them until their nipples bleed? Maybe, I have no idea. Maybe Zack hasn't decided yet. Either way, Belisarius' betrayal of the king is meant to be an important moment of world building, as it is supposedly thanks to this event that the Imperium is the way that it is in the present day. But because the world this event takes place in has barely been established at all, this event is not meaningful whatsoever. I don't know what this means for the Imperium, and I don't know how things would have been different had this not happened. Also, how did Belisarius know that Issa was Space Jesus? Were her magical powers well known throughout the Imperium? If so, did the king know that he was being influenced by space magic? How did he feel about this? Oh, I guess we need to stay tuned for the Zack Snyder Ultimate Bumper Edition of Rebel Moon Part 7, Revenge of the Backstories, to find out. Anyway, the king suspects that something is wrong because the Kali is not here, and the furnaces are not lit.
Strange. Something's wrong. Where is the Kali? Why aren't the furnaces lit?
I will get back to what the Kali is later.
Answer me, man!
I can speak with an English accent.
I also don't know if the bags on the heads of the string quartet were a giveaway, as we later see these same bags on the heads of prisoners intended to be executed, but I have no idea what the purpose of the bags is in this scene, however, as the string quartet are neither prisoners nor are they being executed. Presumably, Belisarius hired these musicians so as to send the king off with a jaunty tune. The piece of music they play is diegetic in that it is not simply a part of the soundtrack. These musicians are literally playing the piece of music as the scene takes place. They are so skilled at what they do that not only do they dynamically change the pace and intensity of the music so as to become more dramatic when the reenactment of an East London council estate begins, but they also manage to adjust the speed at which they play, so that when Zack habitually slips into slow motion, the music remains at its normal speed. Some serious tempo shifting and on-the-fly transposition is going on right here, which is a far more impressive idea than anything else in this movie. So Belisarius decides to assassinate the royal family. He and his fellow conspirators decide to use knives to accomplish this, and I don't have any explanation for why they decided to do this, other than that it looks vaguely like the assassination of Julius Caesar, which means that Zack presumably wanted to evoke a particular feel and wanted to facilitate certain specific visuals when writing this scene. This, in pure isolation, is absolutely fine. Starting with the desired visual of a husband and wife being torn from their daughter and stabbed during a coup is perfectly reasonable, provided these actions make sense within the universe they take place in. Had Belisarius lined up the royal family in front of a firing squad and executed them, then, narratively speaking, the same thing would have been accomplished, but the visual impact would have been very different. Stabbings are usually intimate and sadistic, whereas guns are usually dispassionate and cold.
Guns are too quick. You can't savor all the little emotions.
So, why is this a problem? Well, Belisarius' plan is to murder the royal family and pin the blame entirely on Kora, his own adoptive daughter, whom he has maneuvered into position as the princess's personal bodyguard. By deciding to assassinate the king and queen using Stone Age technology, Belisarius has found himself in a position whereby his plan cannot succeed. Because Kora is, for some fucking reason, the only person in the room carrying a firearm. At least, that is what I thought. It turns out that there are two guards with laser rifles, but they are predictably as much use as an extra chromosome. Additionally, Belisarius would have gone into this knowing that Kora was going to be armed because he intended for her to kill Princess Issa with her pistol. So, in other words, Belisarius betrayed Kora and attempted to throw her under the bus whilst knowing that she has the combat skills of Jane Wick, that she was armed, and that these two poor fuckers over here would absolutely not be able to protect him from Kora after the betrayal. And that is without even considering the fact that the royal fucking family would absolutely have armed guards of their own. Therefore, through wanting to achieve a particular visual and emotional impact, Zack has depicted Belisarius as a total fucking idiot who doesn't plan more than 5 seconds ahead at any given time. And the cherry on top is that, to make sure we understand what is happening, Zack shows us this. Thank you, Zack. I couldn't have possibly worked that part out for myself. Kora then shoots the two guards and escapes on a dropship. Well, that was remarkably easy. It sure would be a shame if the film established that they can remote pilot these ships. Anyway, Belisarius' plan is retarded. Not only does he not account for Kora's gun, but he also doesn't account for Kora's insane martial skills. Why train Kora to be Jane Wick without having some kind of plan for taking her down? The entire plan relies on capturing Kora and pinning everything on her. Except that, evidently, it didn't, because Kora escaped and Belisarius still pinned everything on her. Also, this plan falls apart immediately if Kora is killed in any one of the many battles she fought in. Why go through all of the effort to adopt, train, and betray Kora when surely there is a better potential scapegoat? Such as, I don't know, one of the many other senators, one of whom very likely pissed Belisarius off at some point by forgetting to shake his hand. So now let's talk about what Kora actually did here. Kora waits for everyone to start going all Julius Caesar on the king and queen before shooting the two AdMech guys behind her. Apparently these two dudes were just kinda chill with the whole stabbing thing, given their reaction, but no, they must also die. She then says, "Sorry kiddo, but honestly my ass is kind of on the line here," and proceeds to turn the princess into Swiss cheese.
I was not expecting that.
Kora is a child murderer. Technically, this may only be attempted murder because Issa is magic and shit, but Kora didn't know that the princess would or could survive being shot in the chest with a plasma rifle. Morally speaking, she murdered a child. She is just lucky that the princess somehow survived, as we learn at the end of the film. Now, why did Kora decide to murder a child? This is a pretty substantial character moment, and in order for Kora to remain sympathetic to either us or Gunnar, it needs to be very clear why she chose to do this. Was it to protect herself? Was it because she was lied to? Was it because she believed the princess's peaceful ways were negatively affecting the prosperity of the Imperium? Or was it because Belisarius told her to and she simply didn't question it?
I was the loyal daughter of my adopted father. I could not betray him or defy him. He had told me the princess must die.
Apparently, it was the latter. She followed Belisarius' plan, presumably under the belief that he would protect her.
Dumb bitch.
Again, because the character work in these films is only ever implied, we have no idea the relationship that Kora had with Belisarius. She says that she was loyal to him, and that's about all we get. What we know from the plot, however, is that Belisarius destroyed her home planet and personally murdered her parents, then kidnapped her and trained her. Then she was loyal for some reason. So loyal, in fact, that she was willing to murder a child. And not just any child at that. A child that has magical powers and was presumably some kind of cosmically pure force of good that was created by the universe to restore balance or some shit. Issa says,
I forgive you.
Right before Kora shoots her, which I guess means that she knows, magically or through intuition, that Kora doesn't really want to kill her, that this decision is out of Kora's hands, and that therefore Kora is deserving of forgiveness because this was not her fault. Taking this into account, what I think the writers wanted here was for the audience to believe that Kora chose to kill Issa because if she refused, Belisarius would kill both of them. Therefore, Issa was going to die anyway, and so Kora chose to save herself, hence why Issa preemptively forgives Kora. There is just one teeny tiny problem with this, however. Actually, yeah, there are two. The first is that Kora could have warned the princess and her father that Belisarius intended to assassinate them, and she chose not to. And secondly, after shooting Issa and being betrayed by Belisarius, Kora manages to escape, which suggests that she could have potentially tried to escape with Issa. She just needs to pop the two most useless guards since Martin Sheen and Tim Robbins, jump in a ship, and fuck off. After Kora murders a little girl, Belisarius throws her under the bus and declares her
a cancer of ethnic impurity.
So I have no idea what is meant by this. The character of Kora is non-white, and Sofia Boutella is Algerian. Is this just a throwaway line to make sure that the audience knows that, aside from being a murderous, treacherous, genocidal, warmongering scumbag, Belisarius is also a racist? Maybe, but Kora was not born in Algeria. Are the people from planet Kora considered by the Imperium to be ethnically impure? One read of this might be that Belisarius is racist, because Belisarius is bad, and racism is bad, and so naturally the two walk hand in hand. But I am going to do exactly what Zack doesn't want me to do. I am going to pay attention to his film, and I am going to think about what the implications of this line are. Maybe Belisarius chose, raised, and framed Kora because people from her particular planet are considered for whatever reason to be ethnically impure, and because the Imperium is racist, they would accept that she murdered the royal family due to their prejudice. However, if this is the case, then how and why was Kora ever able to attain the position she did without anyone noticing? Belisarius took Kora in as his adoptive daughter and trained her, always intending to use her as a scapegoat to allow him to pin the murder of the royal family on Kora. So maybe he was like, okay, guys, I know she's Algerian, but just trust me on this. She's gonna help us out in a decade or so when I want to wipe out a bloodline by killing 3 people. Unless that happened off screen repeatedly, I have to simply conclude that the reason Belisarius calls Kora a cancer of ethnic impurities is because he's a baddie.
Pretty pathetic, huh?
Issa's last words to Kora are, "I forgive you," and Kora tells Gunnar that this motivated her to not give up, to run, and to try to be more than a weapon. Despite the fact that the first thing she did after hearing those words was blow a hole through her chest. And, rather amusingly, Gunnar's response to Kora telling him, "I murdered a child," is, oh, that's nice. Stick your tongue back in my mouth. We now come to the infamous Grain Montage, as Zack has decided for some reason that power over Grain is power over all. This portion of the film takes for fucking ever. We have a montage of slow-motion farming, and then we cut away to the King's Gaze for a minute or so, back to more slow-motion farming, then we have the King's Gaze contacting Private Aris, and then we have even more slow-motion farming, because I guess Zack didn't think the audience would get the message the first 2 times. If we remove the 2 cutaways to the King's Gaze, this montage goes on for 4 minutes and 47 seconds. There is just shy of 5 minutes of screen time in Rebel Moon Part 2, The Scargiver Cable, that is dedicated almost entirely to showing the audience people gathering grain in slow motion. 5 minutes doesn't sound like a lot, but in a film as empty as this, it is 5 minutes too many. It isn't inherently a problem to take your time in a movie. The problem comes about when a movie is slow and empty. Slow-paced films can be packed with information. In the case of the Grain Montage, however, it is not packed with anything other than grain. All we know is that they are farming, and so we may as well be spending 5 minutes looking at a page from the script of Rebel Moon saying they are farming. Now, I will quickly explain what character information is present within this montage. We get 2 small pieces of setup for 2 separate characters. One moment that I do genuinely appreciate is when this kid tries to play with Nemesis before she grabs the piece of grain and tries to hide a smile. Nemesis's past is that her kids were all killed by the Imperium, and now the film is giving her something new to care for, rather than simply being a creature of vengeance. The problem is that the writers do very little with this. This is the start of an idea, and the audience is meant to infer that Nemesis establishes some kind of maternal relationship with this boy. As with pretty much everything in this film, the character development is implied. Zack either doesn't want to, or doesn't know how to, explore or develop their bond. Instead, we skip straight to the payoff, which I will get to later. The second piece of character information in this sequence is that General Titus stops drinking. He liked to drink, and now he doesn't. He has become a changed man, and he has found his purpose. This would have been the rare, possibly single, moment of subtlety in Rebel Moon if not for the fact that Kora later tells everyone that Titus has been drinking water instead of booze so as to hide the fact that he is worried about the upcoming battle and that he is taking his job to protect the peasants very seriously because they all depend on him and he's in charge and he likes the alcohol but he stops. Character writing, folks. Additionally, General Titus's alcoholism doesn't really make a huge amount of sense on the face of it, which I will get to later when I summarize each character. So the outcome of this grain montage is that the villagers are magically able to harvest all of their grain in 3 days because they have 4 extra people helping them. We also see that they have space horses pulling a hover cart, Exhibit A for the technology in these films making zero sense. In part 1, Noble offered to pay the villagers.
I have plenty of harvesters. Robots and won't have to do this difficult work by hand.
I know that this hover cart is not a harvester nor is it a robot, but it is still an advanced form of technology that the villagers are using to make their lives easier. This means that the villagers of Velt are not technophobes.
We believe that doing the work by hand connects us to the land.
Is evidently bullshit, which simply makes me wonder why they are still a backwards village of peasant farmers. Additionally, this hovercart thing is being pulled by space horses, which would not be necessary. If the thing is hovering, it could simply be pushed by hand with minimal effort. Why are you still using beasts of burden if you have mastered gravity? I swear to God, this movie. During the grain montage, we cut back to the king's gaze on 2 separate occasions. Noble yells a bunch of evil things about how he wants to skin everyone's children. This AdMech dude who just brought Noble back to life then tells him that they need to complete tests to ensure that he is fit for duty. Naturally, because Noble is evil, he murders the guy via a combination of superhero strength and gun, which is an interesting decision, both from Noble and from the writers. If they wanted to show that Noble's brain is all fucky, then just have him go beast mode on this guy and pummel him into the ground. Instead, he methodically asks for his gun and executes him. Anyway, Cassius apologizes to Noble.
Apologies for the scar that was left by this incompetent medical team. I'm sure it can be removed.
And Noble replies that they should leave the scar, because Kora is the one who gives scars. She is the Scargiver, and he wants to be reminded of the fact that Kora does scars, and the scar-making one is she, and she's the one who he is fighting, and every time he looks at the scar that she gave him, he will remember that he needs to beat her. Do I have that right, Zack? He wants to keep the scar so that when he delivers Kora to Belisarius, the scar will stand as a symbol that he brought Kora to justice, by keeping evidence that she badly, almost fatally, wounded him. I don't see the connection, but okay. Anyway, after yet more grain farming, we cut to Cassius having another chat with Private Aris, presumably to keep the protagonists up to date on their ETA. Cassius finally asks where everyone else is, remembering that Aris is not the guy in charge.
I've not seen Faunus or Marcus during your reports.
At last, the penny fucking drops. So did Cassius suddenly grow a brain cell? Well, no. The reason he asked about the sergeant was because Noble wanted him to, so as to figure out if Aris is lying. Despite the fact that Noble already knows that Kora is on Velt, which means that Aris is obviously lying. The outcome of this conversation leads Noble and Cassius to believe that their troops are dead. It should also have caused them to realize that the villagers know that they are coming, and that the villagers have access to the dead soldiers' weapons, including grenades and rocket launchers, but that would have required that someone proofread the script, which was evidently not on the menu. Neither of them are prepared in the slightest, because neither character is capable of thinking or considering any information other than information that was explicitly spelled out to them. After gathering all of their grain, the villagers decide now is the time for a
P-A-R-T. Why? Because I gotta!
I am unsure why they have the time to do any of this, and I'm also unsure why Sam was spending her time making gifts instead of plowing the fields. Yeah, so Sam presents our group of interchangeable heroes with embroidered banners that have been uniquely crafted so as to represent each of them. This scene implies that we have learned about these characters, and that the villagers have also learned about them since their arrival. This is fucking terrible. Instead of giving us character development or exploration, we got slow-motion montages of grain harvesting, and then cut to this scene, where the implication is that the villagers have gotten to know these action figures masquerading as characters during the last 3 days. Rather than giving us character information, Zack simply pretends that he did that, and jumps ahead to the payoff. The villagers deliver exposition to the audience in virtually the exact same way that Noble did at the end of part 1, without the audience actually seeing or understanding any of these characters beyond their superficial details. It is a payoff without a setup. Had the film dedicated time to showing us the villagers bonding with their protectors, as seen in, Seven Samurai. Actually, no, we don't need to set the bar anywhere near that high. We see this happen in A Bug's Life.
I got you!
You guys, I've got an idea!
Snap, I'm going to snap!
Bye-bye, birdie! Help! I'm stuck!
Bird! Our Blueberry Troop salutes you bugs for rescuing our smallest member, Princess Dot.
Instead of putting in any effort to show us how these characters have bonded as a team, Zack has repurposed the payoff to serve as an exposition dump. He doesn't know how else to do this. How else are we supposed to learn that Titus is a mountain, Tarak is noble yet untamable, Nemesis is fierce and motherly, the hamburger is the burger burglar, Guna is the village's heart, and Kora is the village's guardian? In a normal movie, even a bad one, the writers would usually communicate this information through dialogue and action. And no, I don't mean Zack's trademark, hello, allow me to tell you my backstory. You guys know what I think of Rings of Power, but even in that, the way we learned about Elrond and Durin's strained relationship, for example, was through their argument in their first couple of scenes.
Durin, have I offended you?
To answer that one, we'd need a longer lift.
I journeyed here to see my friend whom I've greatly missed.
Missed? You missed my wedding! The birth of my children, 2 of them!
Durin didn't sit Elrond down and say, please, Elrond, tell me your backstory. The way we learned about Kemen's relationship with his father Pharazôn is through their discussion about his political maneuvering in Númenor.
What makes you think Miriel's mind and my own are not as one in this?
Because my father would sooner die than take orders from an elf.
When all this is ended, elves will take orders from us.
The way we learned about Nori's relationship with her parents is through their dialogue exchanges when she gets in trouble.
Do you see a destiny in this? Do you think the stars reached down and touched you? Is that it? Do you think you're special? You're just a child. I know. Ever has your heart been like your father's, but the tallest milkweed gets snipped.
To be absolutely clear, I am not praising Rings of Power here, in much the same way as I wouldn't praise Rings of Power for having the camera in focus or for making sure that the audio wasn't clipping. Rings of Power is shit. These scenes are shit. But at least they got the absolute basics down regarding the communication of character information. One of Rings of Power's many problems is that its characters are shit, but it is generally successful in communicating how shit these characters are. In the case of Rebel Moon, the character development is only ever implied. Zack pretends that he has done something that he has not. The characters act as though they all know each other very well, but this has not happened. We are simply required to accept that it did, because now the villagers are giving them gifts that say, "We are friends now," on them. The only part of this that isn't crystallized piss is Nemesis's reaction to her gift. She is told that she is as fierce as a storm, but offers life-giving rain. The storm is the mother of us all, and her gift causes her to become emotional. Nemesis was a mother, and her children were killed, and she has now found new children to protect. She has reacquired her purpose and has been given the opportunity to do something good, rather than simply assassinating bad guys. As the others start partying, Nemesis looks at her gift, reflecting on its meaning, and sheds a tear. This is not good, for a variety of reasons, namely that Nemesis is barely a character and Zack is cheating, but there is at the very least something here. For this to make sense, we have to accept that during the excessively slow grain harvesting montage, the villagers came to know Nemesis as a formidable fighter, but also as a caring maternal figure plagued by feelings of guilt. She is as fierce as a storm, but also offers life-giving rain in the form of her protection. The villagers, of course, don't know that she is a mother, unless we just kinda write the film for Zack and assume that whilst gathering the grain, she became a mother to the farm kids. This is clearly what we are supposed to think, but this is like if Peter Jackson showed us at the start of Fellowship of the Ring that Frodo and Gandalf are peripherally aware of each other's existence, then kept them both off-screen for the duration of the film, and then had the payoff where Frodo is devastated at Gandalf's apparent death in Moria. There is a potential explanation, a sequence of events that could have led to this kind of emotional response from Frodo, but firstly, this would be a case of making up a far better story in your own head And secondly, the reason the Moria climax is so effective is because of how thoroughly Frodo's relationship with Gandalf had been developed. If you don't develop the relationship and instead imply that it happened off-screen, you severely neuter the emotional impact of the payoff. Imagine if we had seen Nemesis struggle to fit in with the villagers because she was terrified of failing them, as she failed her children. Imagine if we had seen her distance herself from the kids who found her fascinating because she didn't want to become emotionally vulnerable, only to have them taken away. Imagine how much better this scene would have been if we understood and empathized with her as a person. Anyway, then General Titus sings a song and Anthony Botkins listens, and I'm still waiting for the part where I am given something to care about. Having now wasted 3 days gathering grain in slow motion, grain that did not need to be gathered, it is now training day. The villagers' plan is to move the grain into the village, so that the King's Gaze can't shoot them from orbit without also destroying the grain. This relies upon the King's Gaze being able to scan the village from orbit, which is a capability that both Kora, Titus, and Aris would absolutely be aware of. Their plan relying upon this capability means that we can conclude that the King's Gaze can scan planets from orbit. Their plan also includes digging trenches so as to give the villagers the element of surprise. This relies on the King's Gaze not being able to scan the village from orbit, and I don't even know why I fucking bother. The villagers train using the various weapons left behind by the Imperium, plus more basic weaponry that presumably they already had access to, such as hunting rifles and knives. The film draws specific attention to the blood-stained armor worn by the garrison of soldiers killed in Part 1.
Blood won't come out easy, but we could try.
No, it's perfect. Leave it.
But we never see this armor again. It does not form a part of their plan. And on that point, does this armor actually do anything? Because I kinda don't think it does. The weapons in play are plasma guns and laser swords, and this armor appears to offer zero protection whatsoever. They waste a whole load of valuable training time by sending 30 or so of their people off to retrieve Kora's dropship without checking if it still works beforehand. And on the topic of this dropship, if it still works, which it does still work, why did it crash on Velt in the first place? And if it still works, why didn't Kora use it in the previous film? Why did she and Guna ride space horses to the Mos Eisley Cantina and look for a ship and crew to take them off-world, if they already had the means by which to go off-world? And on that point, the only reason why Tarak and Nemesis are even in this film is because Kai, in his infinite wisdom, decided in Part 1 to collect a bunch of big dick outlaws so as to turn them in for maximum money, which means, had Kora and Guna used her dropship to recruit Titus and find the Blood Axes as was their plan, Tarak and Nemesis would not be here, Darien Bloodaxe would still be alive, and Noble would have no idea that Kora is on Velt. Anyway, the farmers activate their farming powers and dig this extensive trench system in one single day. Tarak turns everyone's harvesting tools into weapons.
We have turned your harvesting tools into weapons.
All right.
And the village and its inhabitants are thoroughly prepared for being slaughtered in 24 hours' time.
I don't like making ensemble movies, although I've only made ensemble movies. 99% of the films I've made are ensemble. I don't know why I do that to myself. Dawn of the Dead, Watchmen, 300, put a team together and go do something. Maybe it is my comfort in that arena that really attracted me to this Dirty Dozen style story. Being able to find a character to puzzle piece in to each of the roles and to make a cohesive team is something I felt pretty comfortable with. You know, I've constructed and deconstructed sort of that hero's journey, and so I kind of see it from both sides. And
so far in Rebel Moon, every scene has been some variety of terrible. The sheer incompetence at every level is painfully clear. However, what we are about to dig into is the laziest scene I have ever had the displeasure of talking about. In fact, I can't recall a worse scene in a movie. What you are about to witness is such a fundamental mistake that it is going to take a bit of explaining to make clear why you absolutely do not do this. The setup for this scene is that Titus sits everyone down and says,
"You're all here because I want you to know who the hell you're fighting with. Everyone must share the truth. I'll go first."
Which is Zack's excuse to have a round-table backstory exposition dump. He literally wrote a scene in which the 6 main characters sit around a table and tell each other their backstories.
This is an intelligent film for grown-ups.
Now, before I dig in, is this a bad idea in principle? No. The team getting to know each other will mean that they are more than simply casual acquaintances looking for a payday. If they each know and understand why they are here, then they may be more motivated to fight as a team. The way a competent writer might go about achieving this is by showing the characters bond with each other, and perhaps by implying certain events that may have happened in their past. Events that ultimately informed their decision to come to Velt to fight the Imperium, and events that also informed their decision to stay and fight to the death. What you absolutely do not fucking do is have one of them sit the others down and say, "Alright team, it's backstory time. What do we got?" This is like the meme version of what happened in part 1. I swear to God I can't take much more of this. Anyway, there are 3 main things that I look for in these kinds of expository sequences. There needs to be a valid reason for the character to be explaining their backstory. We need to learn something about the character in terms of their personality, worldview, and motives, not just the mechanical sequence of events that make up the backstory, and we, ideally, also need to learn about the other characters present in the scene through their reaction to this backstory. The literal content of the backstory should not be the singular focus of the scene. Before I look at the specifics of each of the backstories in Rebel Moon Part 2, The Smart Meter, I am going to give you 3 examples of backstory exposition being done exceptionally well. In all cases, I will be extremely vague so as to avoid spoilers as much as possible, and I will not detail what the relevant characters' backstories actually are. However, I will be explaining how the backstories themselves are framed and used as a part of the story. So if you have not yet seen either Seven, RRR, or Shogun, and you want to go in completely blind, then skip ahead to this timestamp. Also, I am not picking these examples to be like, oh, Rebel Moon is bad because it isn't as good as 7 RRR or Shogun. Because, frankly, very few things are as good as 7 RRR or Shogun. I am highlighting these examples in particular so as to explain how valuable a backstory exposition scene can be in the right hands, so as to make it as clear as possible why using the Zack Snyder method of backstory exposition is only ever going to give terrible results. In 7, Detectives Mills and Somerset have captured John Doe, a man they believe to be guilty of a series of crimes. This isn't strictly a backstory, however it is an extremely important exposition dump that is necessary for the audience to understand the villain's actions. The setup for informing the audience of who exactly John Doe is that Somerset asks him, reasoning that he has no reason to hide anything as he has already been caught. Simply put, Somerset is extremely curious as to what kind of man could commit such horrendous acts. Through his explanation, we learn that John Doe is extremely calm and is unaffected by the acts he has committed, until it is suggested that his victims were innocent, at which point he becomes very emotional. He is ideologically driven, finds enjoyment in hurting people, and believes that this is also true of Detective Mills, and he uses this as an opportunity to push Mills's buttons. We learn that Mills is overly confident and views Doe simply as a complete psychopath who can't form a coherent thought. He is sarcastic and rude and would rather mock Doe than try to understand why he did what he did. And we learn that Detective Somerset doesn't entirely approve of Mills's line of questioning, and he seems to want to know what compelled Doe to commit these acts. In RRR, Rama's backstory is explored through 3 separate flashbacks, each being situated extremely deliberately at different points in the main narrative. The first 2 occur after Rama does something he really doesn't want to do, and is then reminded of why he is doing what he is doing. And the third occurs as another character explains Rama's backstory to someone else so as to provide context for why he did what he did. These flashbacks take up a substantial portion of the film, over 20 minutes of its 3-hour runtime, and through the flashbacks we learn in detail why Rama takes the actions he takes in the main narrative. His worldview and motive are thoroughly explored. We don't learn a huge amount about any other characters during the delivery of these flashbacks, or at least not in a way that I can explain without spoiling the film. Additionally, the conclusion of the backstory is only revealed to the audience at a pivotal moment, which is incredibly dramatic and very emotionally effective. This explanation is very vague because I really don't want to spoil RRR. So if you take nothing else away from this video, RRR is a masterpiece and I would strongly recommend it. Potential future video, if you want to see me talk about how incredibly good this Indian epic is, let me know in the comments. And finally, Mariko's backstory in Shogun is explored during a particularly intense scene in which she is forced by her husband to divulge it. The reason he does this is because he does not consider Mariko to be worthy of any respect. We learn that Mariko feels incredible guilt and trauma about her past, and she hates her husband for not allowing her to do anything about it. She also wants John Blackthorne to know the truth about her. This is evident given that Mariko's husband, Buntaro, only speaks Japanese, and therefore Mariko could have just told any old story to Blackthorne in English, and Buntaro wouldn't have known what she said. But she chose to tell the truth anyway. We also learn that Buntaro is sadistic and sees her as an object, and the fact that Blackthorne doesn't want to hear Mariko's story if it is going to cause her emotional pain informs us how deeply he cares for her. So now that I have given 3 examples of backstories being used exceptionally well as a writing tool to deepen the audience's understanding of the characters, to deepen the characters' understanding of each other, and to progress their respective stories, let's take a look at each backstory that is exposited during this scene in Rebel Moon Part 2, The Stab Maker. First up, we have General Titus. Belisarius sent Titus to the planet Sarawu as a show of force to hover above the Parliament to intimidate them during their vote for independence. The Sarawu Parliament voted for freedom anyway, and Titus was ordered to fire on the capital. He refused and was shot down. He survived this somehow, and he and his men unsuccessfully fought against the Imperium forces that had been sent to deal with them. Titus then made a deal with Belisarius and offered his own life provided his men are freed. Obviously, Belisarius killed Titus's men instead, although why he didn't also kill Titus, I have no idea. Yet again, we have an orbital bombardment strike relatively close to these characters, because of course Zack wanted the cool shot. Again. And because the scene cuts away before the shockwave and the wall of fire actually hits them, and because the Snyderoids' brains have not yet developed object permanence, the story can continue. What's the problem with this? You can't say that he should be dead because he's not dead. The film showed us that he's not dead. Titus believes that his surrender betrayed his soldiers' courage and condemned them to their fate, which is, of course, not what happened, but guilty minds, yada yada. The reason Titus is telling the others is so that they understand that he will never surrender, and that therefore, this is a fight to the death.
I'll never surrender.
I kind of figured that they already had this understanding, but it is nice for Zack to make sure General Titus explicitly states this so as to ensure that his target audience understands what is going on. So, why did we learn about this backstory? Because Titus wanted the others to know that he would never surrender, which they would already have known given that the story of what happened to Titus on Sarawu is well known throughout the Imperium. This is in fact the sole reason Kora recruited Titus to begin with. Okay, well, what do we learn about Titus in terms of his personality, worldview, and motives? Well, we learn that he doesn't like the Imperium, and he will never surrender, which, of course, we already knew. Okay, well, do we learn anything about the other characters during Titus's exposition?
Nope!
And so, General Titus's backstory exists solely to tell the audience a thing that he did that the characters already knew that he did. Moving on to the Hamburglar. She explains that she has never been in a proper battle, which makes the idea that she is a lieutenant of the Blood Axe rebels utterly laughable.
When the ships appeared in the sky above my world, they cowered. They said, "What can we do against the might of the Mother World?"
Nothing. You have sticks and stones, they have planet-destroying technology, and I'm amazed that this is a recurring plot point in these films. Anyway, the Hamburglar came from a tribal village. They surrendered to the Imperium because, of course, why would they not? And the Hamburglar's people were spread to labor camps across the universe. She was then rescued by the Blood Axes, who luckily didn't kill any of the slaves in the process, at which point she was recruited by Darien Bloodaxe. I kind of figured that this is what happened, and I have no idea why this is not even hinted at in Part 1, which is partly why the Hamburglar is so funny. So, why did we learn about the Hamburglar's backstory? Because Titus said, alright guys, it's backstory time. What did we learn about the Hamburglar in terms of her personality, worldview, and motives? Well, we learned that she doesn't like the Imperium, and she fights to free others from its oppression. Both of which we already knew. Okay, well, did we learn anything about the other characters during the Hamburglar's exposition? No! And so, like General Titus's backstory, the Hamburglar's only exists to tell us that the Blood Axes rescued her, which is a mechanical plot beat that is irrelevant to this story. Moving on to Nemesis. Fishing village. Imperium killed them all. She roboted herself. I am become revenge, destroyer of kill. I have no idea why Nemesis decided to cut her arms off and replace them with robot arms. These arms don't appear to actually do anything different to regular arms. We do see later in the film that the totally not lightsabers get extremely hot on the handle, meaning that you can't just pick them up and use them like one might use a conventional sword, or lightsaber for that matter. Setting aside the rather catastrophic question as to why the fuck these things would have been designed in this manner, we see multiple people wielding these totally not lightsabers. In the case of Kora and Noble, we know that they do not have robot arms, which means that robot arms are not necessary to use these things. Another amusing detail is that we see Nemesis use the sword in her right arm, which was removed off-screen, to remove her left arm so as to replace it with a robot arm. The film doesn't show us how she removed her right arm because this would not have been possible. She can't hold the sword without a robot arm, so how did she remove the first arm? Anyway, another problem with this comes later in the film, as we see that Kora is able to wield one of these swords by wrapping a length of fabric around the handle so as to not burn her hand off, which means that these things are firstly not particularly hot, and secondly, Nemesis could have just wrapped a piece of her clothing around the handle instead of cutting her fucking arms off. But random, I hear Zack cry. There is a reason why Nemesis replaced her arms. All right, Zack, I'll tell them. So, Nemesis explains that the bloodlust of her ancestors still lived in the ancient gauntlets. Her blood awakened them. They showed her how to fight. Yeah, I can't. Sorry, Zack, I can't. So Nemesis didn't learn how to become a super awesome cyborg killing machine. She didn't already have these skills and then augment them with cybernetic enhancements. She didn't, through sheer dedication, train herself into a murder bot so as to get her revenge. From what the film tells us, she replaced her arms with robot arms, and the robot arms told her how to fight. I'm keeping that in, I don't care. Her ancestors were a people of war, and I guess their war skills were in their blood that was in the arms. And Nemesis and her fellow fish people kept the war gloves in case they ever needed to become cyborgs, I guess. Okay, why did we learn about Nemesis's backstory? Because Zack wanted us to. What did we learn about Nemesis's personality, worldview, and motives? She doesn't like the Imperium, she is fire, she is death, which we already knew. Okay, well, did we learn anything about the other characters during Nemesis's exposition? No! And so, like General Titus and the Hamburglers' backstories, Nemesis exists purely to tell us why she has robot arms and that she wants revenge. I am starting to sense a pattern here. And finally, we have Tarak's backstory. He is a prince who lived on planet Hippogriff. His father was killed by the Imperium when he attempted to negotiate. His mother went skydiving without a parachute because she was really sad. The Motherworld attacked Tarak's planet because they are evil, and somehow they did not capture or kill Tarak despite him being royalty, and despite the fact that the Motherworld is capable of scanning planets with incredible detail until it becomes inconvenient for the plot. The explanation we get is that Tarak was smuggled off-planet in a refugee transport, which relies on the presupposition that the Imperium would not blast those fucking things out of the sky, but I guess they either didn't notice them or didn't care.
I ran for duty's sake, for the preservation of a kingdom and a bloodline that no longer exists.
I mean, the kingdom doesn't exist, sure, but the bloodline does. The bloodline is in fact currently telling the audience his backstory.
I was robbed of my opportunity to defend them.
No, that isn't what happened. The opportunity to defend his kingdom was not robbed from him. He chose to flee to preserve his bloodline. Unless Tarak means that his duty robbed him, which doesn't really make any sense. He claims that when he finishes defending Velt, he will go back to his home and we will get to witness the thrilling conclusion of the tale of Tarak, in Tarak, a Rebel Moon story. Okay, why did we learn about the backstory? Script. What did we learn about Tarak's personality, worldview, and motives? He wishes he could have saved his mother, but was compelled by duty to flee so as to preserve the royal bloodline. Why she couldn't flee with him, I have absolutely no fucking idea. Just give her one of these cool hats and I'm sure no one will recognize her either. Okay, did we learn anything about the other characters during Tarak's exposition? And with that, we have made it through the worst scene I have ever had the displeasure of talking about. This scene is a waste of 10 minutes. The audience learns nothing from these flashbacks other than the literal sequence of events that took place. And in all 4 cases, these flashbacks have nothing to do with the main plot of Rebel Moon in a narrative sense. The contents of these backstories is completely irrelevant to the story being told. All 4 are virtually identical in terms of how they impacted each of the characters. Titus, the Hamburglar, Nemesis, and Tarak all had nice, peaceful lives, until one day the Imperium turned up and killed everyone. Now tormented by the fact that they couldn't save their friends and family, they have sworn to kill bad and save good. And to be clear, if these flashbacks were not filled with strange and incoherent storytelling beats, then there would be no reason why Nemesis, for example, couldn't have something approximating the backstory she receives in this film. Just maybe find a more purposeful way to incorporate the backstory into the narrative than going, okay gang, it's backstory time, so that it actually serves a purpose within the story being told, rather than functioning as, wow, look at how cool the robot arms are. Isn't she such a badass for cutting her arms off? It's all samurai and swords. Oh, there's a squirrel in the garden. I know I said we were done with backstories, but Kora is then asked to tell her story, which the audience already knows because she did this 3 times already. But we do it again because fuck it, why not? Orphan, military, serve the Imperium, family, real family, boom, done.
Anything else you'd like to add?
Kora, however, leaves out a few key details, namely that she was/is the adoptive daughter of Belisarius, the man currently ramming his dick down the throat of the universe, plus, of course, the fact that she blew a hole through the chest of Space Jesus. I can understand her not wanting to admit this to Titus, who appears to already know what Kora did, but Titus clearly wants Kora to come clean and reveal this to the others, and them not already knowing relies on none of them recognizing Kora at any point, despite her being the most wanted criminal in the known universe. Additionally, if the whole point of Titus initiating backstory.exe was so that the 6 of them can understand who they are fighting with, then it is more than a little absurd that he doesn't tell anyone about that one time when Kora murdered a child. So, after wasting 10 minutes of our time with some of the most laughably incompetent writing I have ever seen, they detail their immediate plan for the following day. They will kill the handful of officers that the Imperium sends down to collect the grain, and afterwards they will negotiate a trade, presumably offering an amount of grain in exchange for the Imperium leaving them alone. This doesn't work for multiple reasons. If they do offer an amount of grain, and if the Imperium takes this grain, then the villagers have lost their bargaining chip, and there will be zero reason why the Imperium can't educate the peasants with some well-placed democracy. And additionally, and hilariously given his backstory that we were just moments ago told about in explicit and needless fucking detail, General Titus agrees with this, and says that he believes that the Imperium would accept such a trade.
You went full retard, man.
This does not line up at all. He knows from first-hand experience that the Imperium is ruled by a sadistic, bloodthirsty, and utterly immoral psychopath who will kill thousands of his own troops from orbit in order to send a message to one man. There is no way in hell Titus or Kora should believe that the Imperium will even consider negotiating, in particular after the villagers have slaughtered a bunch of their men. Gunnar could maybe have believed this, as he is supposed to be the naive one. If Tarak, Nemesis, or the Hamburglar had suggested it, it would have been extremely funny, and I would have called them mean things. But the idea that Titus, the man who served as a general under Belisarius, and witnessed firsthand how sadistic he is, would genuinely believe that they would negotiate is as close to a plot hole as it is possible for a character inconsistency to be. Kora waits until the morning, the day that the Imperium is due to arrive, to hide the dropship she escaped on. This is needlessly risky, as the Imperium is of course capable of scanning planets, and so not doing this earlier means that she can't know that the Imperium doesn't know about it. The reason she is hiding her dropship is so that the Imperium doesn't see it, and she plans to use it later to sneak onto the King's gaze.
But random, why don't they hide the women and children here?
God damn it! Oh. Wait, retarded alter ego, that actually makes sense. Kora hiding the dropship here suggests that the Imperium cannot scan behind waterfalls for some reason, which then raises the question as to why the women and children were not also brought here and are instead chilling in the Longhouse. The film has just established that there is a somewhere safe, and yet this somewhere safe is not where they take the women and children. Well done, I'm proud of you.
Please, can I have ice cream?
No, you haven't eaten your vegetables. Here, have some asparagus.
Yeah!
So anyway, after successfully and inexplicably hiding her dropship from the Imperium, she realizes that Anthony Botkins is also here. Anthony Botkins has, with one single exception, done nothing in Rebel Moon. Because Zack doesn't have any faith that his audience will remember who the hell this character is, he makes sure to have Anthony Botkins explain.
I was given memories of a world I will never see, loyalty to a king I cannot serve, and love for a child I could not save.
He is essentially a robot without a directive. He was programmed to protect the royal family, and because he was not present when they died, he drifts around aimlessly looking for something to do. This is an interesting idea that the writers unfortunately do absolutely nothing with. We also have no idea where these robots came from, why they can't be reprogrammed, why they can't make more, how many there were, and why Anthony Botkins was not serving as the royal family's bodyguard when they were assassinated. Also, just sliding this in here for no particular reason, we have to assume that Anthony Botkins is unaware that Kora is the one who murdered the princess. Because if he did know, then he would presumably shove his hand up her ass and turn her inside out, given that he was programmed to protect the princess, and Kora is the one who murdered the princess. Unless I guess we are expected to believe that he was programmed to just be totally cool hanging out with the princess's assassin. The problem with all of this is that Anthony Botkins must know that Kora murdered the princess. She is the most wanted fugitive in the universe. Belisarius pinned the whole assassination on her. The Imperium believes that Kora is responsible for the whole ordeal, and so Anthony Botkins would have to know, either because of innate programming whereby an update was issued to the robots, or because someone told him. This means that we are expected to believe that Anthony Botkins knows that the princess is dead, but inexplicably doesn't know that Kora was her assassin, despite Kora being wanted throughout the universe for assassinating the royal family.
By all accounts, it doesn't make sense.
So anyway, Kora attempts to convince Anthony Botkins to help her fight the Imperium.
You and I are alike, designed to kill for them.
We're not so different, you and I.
You must know you cannot win.
I mean, yeah, best character in Rebel Moon. He's the only character with a brain, despite being the only character without a brain. I also have no idea why he has antlers and a robe, and can only assume that Zack has some goodies prepared for us in the extended cut. Anyway, Anthony Botkins then pieces out and doesn't help Kora or the villagers, suggesting that he is incapable of basic computation. In part 1, his exposition dump with Sam woke up a part of his programming, and so when Sam was being attacked by the soldiers, he intervened. Sam reminded him of the princess, and his programming would not permit him to allow any harm to come to her. However, it takes the entire fucking movie for him to realize that the Imperium are attacking the village, and that Sam is in that village, and that if the village dies, then Sam dies, and that therefore, in order to ensure no harm comes to her, he needs to fight the Imperium. The Imperium has now arrived at Velt. They are capable of scanning the village from orbit and seeing exactly where the villagers are, which lines up with about half of what we have seen so far, and hilariously contradicts the other half, because this movie is about as consistent as South Africa's power grid. Noble then confirms what I said earlier.
It's the grain. Look, they piled it against the building so we can't destroy them.
Clever.
Confirming that the King's Gaze does desperately need this grain. To acquire the grain and Kora, he decides to negotiate, whilst simultaneously dispatching the Crypteia to capture the women and children. The Crypteia are a reference to the ancient Spartan military, and despite there being no similar naming conventions in Rebel Moon, Zack likes ancient Sparta, so Zack is going to call them the Crypteia. And then we see the full might of the Imperium's landing forces, including at least 23 dropships, either containing men or these spider robot walkie boys. The only reason the villagers can fight against this is because the film says so. This battle is over before it begins. This is not comparable to, say, the final battle in Avatar. The Na'vi were, of course, the technological underdogs. They were outgunned, but they had advantages. They exploited their knowledge of Pandora's geography, they are biologically far stronger and more resilient than humans, and they had a numerical advantage even before the planet decided to help them. In Avatar, it is acceptable for the Na'vi to defeat the humans without requiring that the humans are idiots. This is very much not the case in Rebel Moon. If we were to tweak Avatar to make it more accurately reflect the power imbalance in Rebel Moon, imagine that the humans' scanning technology was fully functional, that the humans outnumbered the Na'vi 10-1, and that the Na'vi were human-sized and prior to fucking yesterday, they had zero combat training. That is pretty much what we get in Rebel Moon Part 2 Fuck You. And even if, miraculously, the villagers harness the power of teamwork and defeat the soldiers, robots, ships, and dreadnought, the Imperium will obviously return and ram an exterminatus bomb so far into Velt's asshole that the rebel moon will be vomiting napalm until the end of time, which no doubt everyone will just forget about, much like they forgot about the King's Gaze after the end of Part 1. Anyway, we also have a rather blatant visual inconsistency, as some of the dropships are leaving behind a massive plume of black smoke that curiously disappears and then reappears in subsequent shots. The dropships land, and Kora realizes that Noble is alive, thus catching her off guard, as she had not prepared for this. She figured they were here for the grain, but Noble's presence means that they also want her. I'm not exactly sure what this changes, however, as had it been Cassius she was negotiating with instead, then the bargaining chips each of them had at their disposal would have remained the same. Now, as I mentioned earlier, what Noble needs to do here is tell Kora to get in the dropship, otherwise everyone dies. He doesn't need the Cryptea. He doesn't need his battalion standing at the ready. He doesn't need 23 ships and a bunch of spider robot walkie boys. He needed to send down a pilot in a dropship with a message for Kora. Get in, or I nuke the village. Because there is still about an hour of this movie to go, however, Noble does not do this. Noble then shows Kora the boo-boo he received from the boo-boo dispenser herself, and Kora offers Noble one chance to avoid slaughter. Kora offers him the grain that will feed his soldiers for their voyage back to the Motherworld, which I actually like. Kora is not being unreasonable here, and she doesn't want to just murder everyone. Yet. However, this comes seconds after she stated that her intention was indeed to kill Noble.
Tell me what we're trying to achieve here.
The same thing as the last time we met. I kill you.
Also, this implies that the King's Gaze does not have enough food on board to sustain its crew back to the Motherworld, which means that had Noble actually died, then the King's Gaze would have been bound by protocol to return to the Motherworld, thus dooming its crew to starving to death in transit. Kora attempts to negotiate some of the grain in exchange for safety, again forgetting who she is talking to, and that there is no way out of this that doesn't involve them all being crushed, ground into little pieces, and then blasted into oblivion. Noble is asked to choose between being disgraced for having failed to capture Kora, or having his head cleaved from his shoulders, his ship serving as his tomb. This is exactly what ends up happening, but at this point, Kora intended for Noble to die in the village. She can't have known that when she boarded the King's Gaze as planned, that she would have a final boss battle with Noble, which I guess means that Kora is clairvoyant, but whatever, it sounds cool if you have the mind of a 7-year-old and the attention span of a goldfish, so who am I to judge? Noble then correctly states that Kora has zero negotiating power. He calls Kora's bluff. Noble's plan at this point is to distract Kora while the Cryptea infiltrate the village and grab the women and children to use as hostages, so as to force the villagers to part with the grain. Therefore, Noble does need this grain, which is absurd, but alright. They have the technology to resurrect people, but they don't have the technology to create some kind of calorie paste to make sure their soldiers don't starve to death whilst liberating the galaxy. But anyway, those are the stakes, and that is his plan. This plan also relied entirely upon the Imperium's capability to scan planets from orbit. Kora, Titus, and Aris would have known that the Imperium can do this, which means they also have to know that the Imperium knows they have stashed the women and children in the Longhouse. Does the film acknowledge this? Kora finds herself in a checkmate and decides to surrender because Noble sends troopers to the Longhouse in secret without anyone knowing and without anyone seeing this coming. In other words, the reason why Kora finds herself having to surrender to Noble, which would lead to her being executed as a traitor, is because she, Titus, and Aris all forgot that the Imperium can scan from orbit, even though simultaneously their plan relied on the Imperium's ability to do exactly this.
What is happening?
Kora wanted to surrender to save the villagers because she didn't want any more children to die. This means that she, and the villagers as a whole, did not account for and were unaware of the group of soldiers infiltrating the village. This is an immediate hiccup in their plan. Kora has been outplayed from the outset. After deciding to surrender, Noble allows her to say goodbye to Guna. She doesn't tell Guna, they have men at the Longhouse ready to kill the children. We have been tricked. We can't fight. They have all the leverage. She instead says this.
I'm sorry. I won't allow this place to die for me.
Which is about as vague a thing as she could have said. Luckily, however, Guna interprets this as Kora has decided to give up, and I won't let her give up. I need to give her hope, because that is what Zack Snyder told the audience is the thing that I do.
Gunnar, you give us hope.
And then, thanks to a misunderstanding prompted entirely by a character saying exactly the wrong thing at exactly the wrong time, Gunnar initiates combat against Kora's wishes because Kora failed to tell Gunnar why she is surrendering. In summary, this plot point is one of the most retarded plot points in Rebel Moon because it relies on A. Kora forgetting that the Imperium can scan planets whilst simultaneously concocting a plan that relies on their ability to scan planets. B. Kora not explaining to Gunnar why she is surrendering. C. The women and children being stashed in the Longhouse instead of somewhere outside of the village. And D. The soldiers being able to infiltrate the village without anyone noticing. Anyway, jumping ahead momentarily, the film forgets that Kora wanted to surrender so as to save the women and children. This would have been a pretty selfless and noble thing to do, but because no one in these fucking movies communicates like a normal fucking person, Gunnar initiates the attack anyway, and we never learn what Kora thinks about him doing this. Kora should be furious with Gunnar. She should be under the impression that a lot of innocent people are going to die for no reason other than that Gunnar couldn't let her go. My guess is that Zack does not care what Kora thinks about this, however, because we, the audience, know that the women and children are in the Longhouse and are protected by Nemesis, and we see everything that happens as a result of that, so why would Zack bother to tell us what Kora thinks about an event that we see taking place elsewhere? Setting aside the fact that Kora has every reason to believe that Noble would immediately nuke the village as soon as he returns to the King's gaze, from Kora's perspective, she was willing to sacrifice herself to save the women and children, and Gunnar has just put them all at tremendous risk. Before the bullets start flying, I need to remind you of a few points that are utterly broken, but are necessary for the rest of the film to happen. The peasants dug a tunnel network in 5 days using farm equipment. The Imperium forgot that the villagers would obviously have the weapons left behind by their soldiers. The Imperium scanners can scan through buildings from orbit, but cannot scan holes, and therefore were unable to detect the peasant hiding 2 feet below the surface holding a rocket launcher. So yeah, this dude pops up and explodes the dropship and a whole bunch of soldiers, because they all landed in perfect formation so as to allow him to do so. As soon as this happened, Kora should have expected the Crypteia would break into the Longhouse and start gunning people down. Yes, Nemesis is there, but she can't deflect laser fire from 10 guys aimed at civilians. Oh, wait, sorry, I forgot. Zack has done this kind of thing before, hasn't he? Gunnar and Kora then decide to head for the dropship so as to get Kora to the King's gaze.
Come on, Kora! We need to get you up to that ship!
Why? Is it so that she can kill Noble, thus forcing the King's gaze to go home and forget what happened? Or is she going to blow it up so that the pieces of debris can rain down on top of the village in an apocalyptic firestorm?
Come on! You're our only chance!
God fucking damn it, I do try to avoid repeating myself, but this film has an annoying habit of reiterating things that don't make sense, so now I feel obligated to reiterate why it doesn't make sense. Even if everything goes to plan, and they wipe out the King's gaze, Noble, and all of the soldiers, that does not mean you win. Anyway, Noble then goes on a hilarious rampage. This peasant dude then sees this psychotic space Nazi approaching and tells this woman, "Here, have a pistol and hold it backwards." Oh no, we both died. Whoops. Den then pops up from another hole and a bad guy spawns directly in front of him, and after dealing with him, Den grenades a ship in slow motion. And the pilot's response to this is...
oh, damn.
And I think this is meant to be funny. And it is, honestly, because it is terrible. It is funny precisely because Zack thought it would be funny. After a brief cutaway, Den challenges Noble to Mak Gorah. I am not too sure what he was thinking. I don't have any explanation for why he doesn't use the gun he was holding, or why he doesn't pick up the rocket launcher nearby, or why he doesn't use any explosives. He decides to throw his gun away so as to use his fists, only to later decide to use his knife.
Where did you train? On a farm?
The villagers then release the hose, and a man with no shirt and an axe proves to be infinitely more effective than men with guns. They're also not gunned down immediately because, of course, plot armor is vastly more effective than the armor worn by any of the soldiers.
We can't let Titus and the others do all the work. Are you ready to fight and die?
Why are you still here saying, "Oh man, we better go help the others"? Why, what do you guys think? Can we do it? Get out there right fucking now and help your friends. Anyway, after a whole load of slow motion, the villagers appear to have won, and I will get right back to them after dealing with the events in the Longhouse. After a good few minutes of fighting, the Cryptea decide to break into the Longhouse rather than doing so immediately. Nemesis fights them, and this is totally different to Star Wars because the colors of the lightsabers are, switched. Speaking of, there are 5 guys here. There are actually more of them, but they have to wait their turn, of course, so as to not test the limits of the choreographer's skills. This is not Ip Man, you see. Of the 5, 1 has a gun. The other 4 have lightsabers. And it sure is a good thing that these men did not all bring guns, because if they did, everyone in the Longhouse is dead. The first time I watched this scene, I actually gave the film the benefit of the doubt. I figured that the Cryptea carried guns and swords, and they then fired the guns at Nemesis only for her to block them, and then decided to fight her in melee. There would have still been problems with this scene had that been what actually happened, but that would have been vastly preferable to what we got, which is that the Cryptea evidently knew that the script called for a sword fight, and so they all ran in with swords instead of guns. Anyway, Nemesis fights them off, powered by her robot arms containing the blood memories of her ancestors who were really good at fighting. This guy also helps Nemesis by going to stab the floor for some fucking reason, but eventually Nemesis gets her robot arm cut off, which means she no longer has the blood of her ancestors telling her how to fight, and she reverts back to being a fisherman and is promptly defeated. Nemesis goes down trying to protect the children. Finally, after 3 hours and 14 minutes of subjecting my brain to Zack Snyder's Rebel Moon, we have an emotional payoff. Nemesis's purpose here is to protect these children, where she failed to protect her own children previously. This is what she prioritizes, and she fights to the end to save them. The kid she didn't actually bond with earlier, but Zack wanted to imply that maybe she did, helps her kill the last guy before she dies. However, Zack is, once again, utilizing an emotional payoff without adequately setting it up. Once again, the setup is implied. The character development and exploration is implied. At this point, honestly, the fucking movie is implied. Rebel Moon Part 2 Only Pain then tries to pull a similar move to Return of the King, with the arrival of the Haradrim during the Battle of the Pelennor Fields.
Make safe the city!
This is to serve as a low point of the battle, and this can help give extended battle scenes some variety in their pacing, rather than just being people fighting for 30 minutes. The difference is that this doesn't really make any sense in Rebel Moon Part 2 My Brain is Numb, because this is not a separate faction that has arrived during the battle. This is the same faction, holding back a bunch of stuff until the first wave is wiped out in its entirety for some reason. I have no idea why they didn't open with the spider robot walkie boys, because they seem impervious to small arms fire, and they seem capable of one-shotting the villagers' wooden shacks and everything inside. It is not a reasonable question to ask why Sauron didn't open with the Haradrim, given how effective they are, because the Haradrim are a separate faction that are on Sauron's side. It is absolutely a reasonable question to ask why the Imperium didn't open with the spider robot walkie boys, because they appear to be extremely effective, and there doesn't appear to be any counterplay to them. Or, at least, there wouldn't be any counterplay to them if the Imperium remembered that they can scan planets, because the Hamburglar, who has just kind of chilled on the sidelines until now, is able to take out the Walker by rocket launching it point blank. No one sees her coming, and no one stops her doing this. She also later curiously ditches her gun in order to use her knife, evidently taking lessons from Den in how to be as inefficient as possible.
I hate women.
Anyway, I will cover Kora's actions on the King's Gaze after covering the battle in the village, but upon realizing that Kora is now on the King's Gaze, Noble orders that they nuke the village.
You may fire on the village.
Sir, the grain.
There's no need for the grain now.
What? I hate you.
Fuck you!
Zack, you can't do this.
There's no need for the grain now. The Scargiver has come to us.
Which I guess means he plans to eat her flesh. Noble had 2 objectives in Rebel Moon Part 2 Stop Making Me Do This. One is grain. The other is Kora. Getting one does not mean you don't need the other. Are we supposed to believe, then, that they no longer need food because they have just gotten a bunch of their men killed?
But we have men on the ground. A few less mouths to feed.
Apparently, yes. which means the Imperium's incomparable incompetence led to them not actually needing the very thing that kicked this story off to begin with. But anyway, they decide to blow up the village, and lucky for the protagonists, it takes them an incomprehensibly long time to actually aim their space gun and pull the trigger. We then get another piece of heavily derivative dialogue taken from The Lord of the Rings.
I thought dying in battle was all I wanted. Fighting for something. I think I was wrong. I don't think I want to die at all. But if I must.
Together.
You don't fucking know each other. The film is tricking the audience into thinking that character relationships have been established and developed, but this has not happened in the slightest. This is not comparable to, I don't know, Pippin and Gandalf's exchanges in Return of the King.
I didn't think it would end this way.
No, the journey doesn't end here. Death is just another path, one that we all must take.
That isn't so bad.
No, it isn't.
And then, at long last, after countless villagers have died, possibly including Sam for all he knows, Anthony Botkins enters the fight. He watched the whole thing and decided, now is my chance. He absolutely fucks these guys up and appears to be bulletproof. Setting aside the fact that he isn't bulletproof, as seen in part 1, the fact that he is this effective in combat should be something Kora is aware of. This is a surprise to the audience, but should not be a surprise to Kora. One would think then that Kora would put in a little bit more effort to get him on her side, but that would of course ruin the surprise. Anthony Botkins told us earlier that the reason he helped protect Sam in part 1 was because the thought of her being hurt or killed woke a part of him that was dormant, referring to the fact that he was pre-programmed to protect Princess Issa. Why, then, he decided to wait until the battle is basically over to protect her again, I have no idea. Characters be damned. All that matters is that the audience get that little dopamine hit of being like, oh, it's the robot. I saw him before. So the conclusion of the land battle is that the villagers win because Anthony Botkins decided to be nice, because the Imperium forgot how to shoot, because the Cryptea brought knives to a gunfight, and because the Imperium didn't use the tools available to them so as to prevent a ground battle in the first place. Meanwhile, Kora has managed to get to her dropship with Gunnar. She waits until a couple of the other dropships head back to the King's Gaze, and then follows them back under the pretense of returning with wounded soldiers. So first up on the metric fuckton of problems with this insanely spastic plan, the Imperium are evidently unable to identify Kora's ship. They would absolutely know whose ship this is. This is the ship that Arthelaus, the Scargiver, the assassin of the royal family, the most wanted fugitive in the universe, escaped on. Even cars have fucking number plates, and yet, for some reason, no one recognizes it. They have no electronic scanners, no ID code, no distinctive markings, nothing. So far, so good. The Imperium are incomparable morons with worse technology than we have in the current fucking year, and so Kora's plan can continue. She pretends that she is returning to the King's Gaze because she is carrying injured soldiers back for medical attention. This means that 2 injured soldiers fleeing combat and returning in a dropship to the King's Gaze is both normal and permissible, which... no fucking way. Noble, Belisarius, and the Imperium as a whole would absolutely dictate that you stand and you fight. You do not board a dropship with your buddy because you got shot in the foot and then retreat on this dropship, thereby depriving the ground forces not only of yourself, but also of the dropship and its weapons, and flee so as to receive medical attention. A squad of soldiers retreating when they are seriously injured is one thing. 2 soldiers retreating in a heavily armed dropship is another. And again, I do not believe for a second that this would be permissible behavior under the rule of the Imperium, who are extremely callous with the lives of their soldiers. But anyway, let's not stick on this point for too long. Let's find out what other insanity Zack has in store for us. Kora and Gunnar return to the King's Gaze from an active combat zone and are picked up by a team of medics, and not one single soldier or guard appears to be accompanying these medics. No one considers it a little strange that this dropship has just returned with 2 injured soldiers aboard. No one confirms the identity of the soldiers, and I know Kora is wearing a bandana, but given how skilled, caring, and otherwise well-trained these medics are, I would have thought that maybe, just maybe, someone might check. But anyway, what happens next is... well, to be honest, it's Zack Snyder's Rebel Moon. What else can I say? The medics wheel Kora and Gunnar into an elevator, where they say that they will conduct a visual inspection of their injuries. The fact that they do this on the elevator, as opposed to in the hangar where they landed or in the infirmary where they are heading to, allows Kora to spring her trap. The only reason Kora and Guna are not found out immediately is because the medics decided to make sure to take them to an enclosed space with no witnesses and no means of raising any kind of alarm. So what does Kora actually do in this elevator, you may be asking? Well, before I get to that, these medics have rather interestingly been depicted as dedicated, committed, caring, and relatively skilled as far as the characters in Rebel Moon go.
I got one down in the hold!
Eric, can you hear me?
Hey, I'm attempting to move you now, okay? Shrapnel damage, infantry seems to be suffering from a small ammo wound. 2 down, not responsive! Bring the gunnies!
My presumption is that Zack told the actors to pretend as though they are paramedics in real life, as their conduct is not at all dissimilar to how a team of paramedics may respond to a car crash. These men are as far from the squad of rapists left in the village in Part 1 as is possible. And so Zack has, deliberately or otherwise, decided to depict these medics as being relatively normal people rather than perverted degenerates. Not that this matters to Kora, however, who murderfucks them all in seconds.
Wait, that's not...
This is a war crime. I had my criticisms of the dastardly rape men in Part 1 because those men were just so absurdly evil that the whole thing became very comical, and those soldiers were clearly characterized in that way so as to make it cathartic and morally righteous when Kora murders them all. That scene was not in any way morally ambiguous. It was crystal clear what Zack wanted the audience to think. Isn't it cool how Kora kills all the rapists in slow motion? And the reason this scene was so funny to me was because of how blatant and manipulative this characterization was in terms of its purpose. Make all of the soldiers morally indefensible perverts who attempted to force themselves on a young girl to make it more cathartic when Kora kills them all. In the case of Kora killing the medics in Part 2, however, Zack has swung the pendulum too far in the other direction. I have no idea what he was thinking. Once again, this is not morally ambiguous. The difference, however, is that the audience is, or should be, firmly on the side of the medics. Unlike the soldiers, they are not rapists, or at least we have no reason to believe that they are. These seem like guys who may be fighting for the wrong team, but they do not appear to be bad people. And Kora has just murdered them. I realize I am talking about Rebel Moon here, and Zack Snyder for that matter, but this could have been a character moment for Kora. She could have been forced by necessity to do something bad in service of something good. Maybe their plan is to subdue the medics without using lethal force, only for her to be confronted by one of them holding a gun at Guna's head, forcing her to kill the guy. Maybe she was forced to detonate a grenade so as to kill a guard, and the medics unfortunately got caught in the blast. The fact is that Kora did not need to kill these men, and yet not only did she do so, but she also showed absolutely no remorse for having done so. And this gets even fucking funnier given what she goes on to do in the next couple of scenes. It is also extremely funny to me that a very similar sequence of events occurred in another film. In this other film, a character escapes from his captors by pretending to be badly injured. He is picked up by a team of paramedics, and he then reveals that he has tricked them before murdering them.
Bring the gunnies!
Sergeant Tate.
Load him up.
He's alive.
2 minutes out. This
Looking good.
on the
Where are you
elevator.
gonna be? The vital signs are good. Pressure is 130 over 90. Ringer's running, and the patient is on 70.
Hannibal Lecter, in The Silence of the Lambs, does virtually the exact same thing Kora does in this scene, which I guess makes it a good thing that they waited until they were in the elevator to inspect the injuries, because otherwise Kora would have murdered even more people. Medics, engineers, pilots, navigators, cleaners, all shall perish. So, in conclusion, it is thanks entirely to the Imperium being idiots that Kora is able to murder the team of doctors so that they can escape into the ship. Guna retains his disguise and heads back to the dropship, whilst Kora continues with her sabotage mission. Kora also does not put her helmet back on.
What?
I'll say that again. Kora does not conceal her identity as the most wanted fugitive in the known universe, and instead decides, fuck yeah, it's main character time. And I am sure this will lead to absolutely nothing. Kora heads straight to the engine room and is confronted with this. And now we need to take a quick detour into the grim darkness of the 41st millennium. There are multiple things I highlighted in part 1 that appear to have been either directly ripped from or heavily inspired by the universe of Warhammer 40,000. In part 2, we also have Cassius and Noble each mentioning the Old Gods, which could admittedly have been an original creation by the writers, as Old Gods is a very generic name for something, and if not for the other 17 things lifted directly from Warhammer 40,000, I wouldn't mention it. Additionally, I somehow missed in my previous video that Blood Axes is the name of an orc clan. But aside from these two relatively minor potential instances of copying and pasting a cool-sounding word from one property into another, we also have probably the most egregious and blatant instance of being influenced by other people's work that has appeared so far in Rebel Moon. This thing appears to be some kind of power source either for the ship itself or for its weapon systems. My first thought was, wait, is the King's Gaze somehow alive? Is this some kind of bastardized and reappropriated version of a machine spirit from Warhammer 40,000? Well, no. This is actually far worse than I first assumed. In Warhammer 40,000, the Catan are star gods that are the oldest intelligent creatures that exist in the galaxy. Millions of years prior to the 41st millennium, the Catan fought with the Necrontyr against the Old Ones. After their victory, the Necrontyr turned against the Catan and contained fragments of the Catan inside shards so as to use them as a weapon. Quoting from the Warhammer Wiki, they are now only echoes of their former selves, splinters of energy that survived their Necron servants' ancient betrayal and were enslaved in turn. Now, what does any of this have to do with Rebel Moon? Well, the Kali are only mentioned once in the film.
Where is the Kali? Why aren't the furnaces lit?
And we have now just seen this gigantic humanoid face inside the King's Gaze. The similarities between the Kali and the Catan are striking. As you may know, I usually disregard external information when talking about a film, as I like to judge a film based on what it is, rather than what went into making it or what some website says a character did off-screen. I would never justify a flaw in a film by saying, it's in the book. Because to me, that is like justifying a shitty meal at a restaurant by saying, well, someone else made this very meal 50 years ago and it was excellent, so stop complaining. Before I read you an excerpt from the official Rebel Moon wiki, let me be clear. I am not claiming that Rebel Moon is bad because of canonical information that exists elsewhere. I am highlighting this to demonstrate how the writers have blatantly copied a concept from another setting and imported it into their own. Quoting the official Rebel Moon wiki, the Kali are interdimensional beings. When the Motherworld figured out how to capture them, they were able to pull seemingly unlimited energy from them, which they used to power their technology, allowing them to invent machinery with almost mystical capabilities. The Kali in captivity are kept in a perpetual dreamlike state. Well, this certainly sounds familiar. The question as to whether or not Zack stole a whole bunch of ideas from Warhammer 40,000 is a different question to whether or not Rebel Moon is a good movie. However, with this added to the rather substantial list of clear similarities I provided in part 1, I feel absolutely confident in saying that Rebel Moon borrows heavily from the universe of Warhammer 40,000. And it is undeniably a shame as a fan of Warhammer to see this kind of thing being shoehorned into one of the worst movies I have ever seen. The King's Gaze runs on coal.
Okay, well, that explains basically nothing.
Why wouldn't the King's Gaze run on coal? What possible reason could there be to use an alternate power source on your intergalactic warship? It just runs on a combination of 19th century technology and enslaved interdimensional energy beings, which is just intuitive. I guess he who controls the coal also controls the universe. There are any number of power sources that the King's Gaze could have run on, including, but not limited to, imprisoned interdimensional star gods, but I guess because Zack wanted Kora to murder even more innocent crewmen, the engine room of this planet-destroying intergalactic behemoth is ripped straight out of the Titanic. Anyway, Kora starts murdering these guys shoveling coal into the furnace because I guess everyone who exists under the Imperium is Satan incarnate. The doctors, the pilots, the poor bastards shoveling coal in a motherfucking spaceship. Every one of them must die. So says Kora, the woman who used to be one of them. We also have absolutely no idea if these guys are slaves, which is not at all out of the question as the Imperium explicitly uses slave labor. Either way, Kora would know, but evidently she doesn't care, because they are in her way. This character is psychotic, and I have no idea why Zack decided to portray her in this way. Yes, her entire plan at this point is to sabotage the King's Gaze, blowing it up and thereby killing everyone on board. This, of course, means that these doctors and laborers she carves her way through would have been killed anyway. And so killing them now, killing them later, what difference does it make? Which brings me to a nice little comparison we can draw between this and Star Wars. Is Luke blowing up the Death Star a morally ambiguous act? If this happened in reality, then maybe a case could be made, but as depicted in A New Hope, the answer is that Luke was absolutely morally justified. Despite the fact that the entire crew of the Death Star, stated in external material to be around 1.5 million people, all died in the process. The moral ambiguity of this act is not something that Star Wars ever addresses, nor does it draw any attention to it. This is in large part because A, the crew of the Death Star are framed as evil from the start of the film, B, the Death Star is seconds away from blowing up Yavin and destroying the rebel base, and possibly most importantly, C, the film does not depict Luke methodically slitting stormtroopers' throats as he fights his way to the engine room. If the writers didn't want the audience to question the morality of Kora bringing down the King's Gaze, then they should not have depicted her murdering doctors, laborers, and imprisoned interdimensional energy beings in the process. And on that point, even if we go solely from what the film shows us and disregard the fact that the Kali is virtually a one-for-one copy of the Catan from Warhammer 40,000, this thing is still seemingly sentient. Kora places explosive charges on its face. We may not fully understand what this thing is because this information is not explicitly in the film. Kora, however, must have known exactly what she is doing, given her rank, which means that, yeah, Kora blew up a sentient being that was being kept in stasis and farmed for its energy.
Mission accomplished.
So anyway, moving on. While Kora throws the poor fuckers in the engine room into the furnaces, one of them raises the alarm.
It's a woman, I'm telling you.
Which notifies Admiral Noble that Kora is on board. I will remind you that this only happens because Kora is not wearing any kind of disguise. Had she put the helmet back on, Noble would not have realized she was on board. Kora then escapes the engine room, kills like 20 more people or something like that. They don't shoot her, they just walk into her and die because obviously. And meanwhile, a group of soldiers head to the engine room to check why Kora was down there, which makes sense as she obviously would have only been down there to sabotage the engine. They, for some reason, however, don't notice the giant green explosive charges that she has placed there until they are about to blow.
What, are you retarded?
They are right fucking there. How did you miss this? Anyway, before everything goes boom, Kora returns to the hangar where Noble is waiting. Guna is hiding in the dropship waiting for Kora, and somehow neither Guna nor Noble was aware that the other was present, which means that Noble did not check the dropship, nor did he open his mouth at any point. Guna then shoots this guy who only exists as an ablative wound for Noble before being shot in the chest himself.
No!
I actually can't decide which of these is worse.
Kalel, no! No! No!
Anyway, they fight again, she wins again. Kora and Guna manage to get into a dropship as the King's Gaze falls from the sky and escape just in time. The King's Gaze crashes into the moon of rebels, and despite its size and explosive disposition, the village is not struck by any kind of apocalyptic shockwave or other damage whatsoever. Everything's just, it's all good. A massive ship just fell from the sky a couple of miles away, but everything's totally fine. Oh no, Guna's dying. Isn't this emotional?
Oh, what a pickle!
We know oh so much about these characters, which means that this scene is totally not two actors reading lines and hoping that I care. The character work was implied, you see. They then rip off The Hobbit.
Look, it's their rebel attacks. The entire rebel fleet.
The Eagles are here.
It's really over. It's...
Thorin.
But too little, too late. Guna has died. Kora is devastated at Guna's death, and I don't really know why. Well, obviously, you may be thinking, Kora is in love with him, and he has just died in her arms. And yeah, that's exactly what Zack wants you to think, because each character said to the other, I love you, and then he died in her arms. That does not make this meaningful, however. That makes this a caricature. This scene is pretending to be something that it is not. It is trying to provide an emotional payoff that has absolutely not been earned in the slightest. Additionally, I will remind you that the only reason why Noble responds to Kora's presence on board the King's Gaze is because she is not wearing a helmet. The security guy in the engine room identified her as a woman, leading Noble to assume, reasonably, that Kora has infiltrated the ship. Had Kora kept the Imperium uniform, she could have avoided being discovered entirely and quietly dispatched the guard who found her, meaning Noble would never have responded to her, meaning Guna would not have died. Guna dies because Kora inexplicably did not wear the disguise that she already had, meaning that the writers have completely undercut what is supposed to be a very emotional moment because this is entirely Kora's fault. And I don't mean it's her fault in an, oh, I should have never taken you with me to the ship. I put you in so much danger. I am so sorry that I have led you into such peril, perhaps. This is not a case of Kora feeling guilty because she was reckless and Guna paid the price. This is a case of Kora doing something that makes absolutely no fucking sense, the writers being unaware that it makes absolutely no fucking sense, and thereby accidentally destroying any hope of a coherent emotional payoff. With the battle now over, the King's Gaze destroyed and the ground troops scattered, this happens.
Form up on me! Yes, Commander, on you.
They're on you.
Devra Bloodaxe arrives with her fleet to save the day. She appears to be here to gun down the Imperium dropships as they retreat, and I am left wondering how many lives could have been saved if they had arrived at any point in the previous 5 days. Why did Devra change her mind? Does she know that Darian is dead? Surely not, but again, the film isn't going to communicate any of this, and so, again, the character work is implied.
Our victories have been tactical ones. We cannot fight in the open against the King's Gaze.
Zack has skipped to the ending. He wanted the Bloodaxes to show up, but he also wanted the villagers to do the fighting. He also presumably wanted Devra Bloodaxe to be part of the crew in Rebel Moon Part 3, so she's here now. It doesn't matter why or how, just, look, it's the character that you know oh so well from Part 1. Anyway, Titus has worked out that Kora is Arthurlaeus, the assassin of the royal family. He worked this out because Kora has the same face as Arthurlaeus, is the same height, the same age, and is the exact same fucking person. And the question as to how he is the only person to have worked this out across both movies is a question that the writers have no intention of answering. Titus reveals that Kora is not actually her assassin, and that the princess is still alive. How Titus knows this?
I have no fucking idea.
This is evidently some kind of secret, because Belisarius has managed to declare Kora the most wanted criminal in the universe. This presumably means that the Imperium and all planets under its rule believe that Kora murdered Issa. Except for Titus. I won't bother elaborating on this point, however, because no doubt this will be revealed in Part 3, but forgive me for not having any faith that it will make a lick of sense. Realizing that Princess Issa is still alive, the survivors all decide to continue fighting, and with that, we have reached the end of Rebel Moon Part 2, I Want to Go Home. There is a misunderstanding in Rebel Moon Part 2 that is necessary to allow the plot to happen. For examples of this kind of thing being done exceptionally well, check out my Arcane videos, as a substantial portion of the plot of Arcane relies upon excellently crafted misunderstandings. Rebel Moon Part 2, however, exists as an example of how to not do virtually everything. The film plays fast and loose with the Grain plot point, and it shifts in importance, seemingly based entirely on what Zack wants the characters to do, but by the end of the film, I think we have enough references to suggest that, yeah, as insane as this sounds, the King's Gaze does actually need the grain. As in, they do not have enough food on board to make it back to the Motherworld without stopping at Veld. This is unbelievably dumb, given the kinds of technology we see them have access to. The fact that the Imperium has cracked warp travel and is capable of imprisoning interdimensional energy beings, but has not worked out how food rationing works, is one of the funniest pieces of so-called world building that I have ever bared witness to. But anyway, let's accept the basic premise and work out just how desperately the King's Gaze needs this grain. On the side of the Imperium wanting the grain because they miscalculated and a bit of extra food might help make their jobs easier, Noble demanded the grain initially to feed his men as they search for the Bloodaxes. As they now intend to return to the Motherworld with Kora instead of continuing to hunt the rebels, this may mean that they no longer need the additional food supplies. Once Noble realizes that Kora is on board the King's Gaze, he decides to nuke the village, and the grain, so as to return home, indicating that the grain is not vital. However, there are multiple points on the side of the King's Gaze being entirely dependent on the grain to even make it back to the Motherworld. The heroes are told that the King's Gaze is returning to Velt, despite this being perceived as a breach of Imperium protocol. The heroes do not know that Admiral Noble is still alive. Therefore, they conclude that the reason why the King's Gaze is returning to Velt is because they still need the grain they demanded in Part 1. It is implied that Imperium protocol is very strict, as if it were in any way flexible, then I'm sure the King's Gaze could just swing by Velt, grab the grain, and nuke them from orbit on the way back to the Motherworld. The reason why I think this is implied is because Titus concludes,
"There must be more in need of this grain than we could have known,"
suggesting that the grain must be really, really, really important if they are willing to break protocol in this manner. The fact that they don't grab Kora and immediately bomb the village would suggest that they do need this grain in order to accomplish what has become Noble's primary mission. He cannot return Kora to Belisarius without acquiring the grain. Otherwise, he would have done so. Setting aside for the moment the fact that in the previous film he blew up a planet confirmed to have lots of food on it, we see Noble commit many soldiers to the retrieval of this grain, which is not something he would do unless he needed to do it. Noble is motivated seemingly entirely by his desire to capture Kora, so as to secure his seat in the Senate. I don't believe that he would engage in a battle against the farmers when nuking them from orbit is an option, unless he did absolutely need the grain in order to be able to return to the Motherworld. Noble is shown to not particularly care about the lives of his soldiers, and so I would have thought it more likely that he would accept some of them starving provided he can make it back with Kora. Additionally, Noble says this,
"But we have men on the ground.
A few less mouths to feed."
Which indicates that, due to their heavy losses in attacking the village, the grain from the village is no longer needed. Which then also suggests that had they not lost so many soldiers in an attempt to get the grain, then the grain would have been a necessity. Otherwise, why would they even bother? All of this makes absolutely no sense in universe, of course, as it makes it fundamentally unbelievable that a faction such as the Imperium could become so powerful and yet be so retarded as to not bring enough food, to not have some kind of mass-producible protein paste, basic food rations, entire planets dedicated to agriculture, etc. And additionally, the King's Gaze appears to be capable of some kind of warp travel, and we have no idea what the limitations of this technology are, and so we have no idea how long it would actually take them to return to the Motherworld. If they can just open a portal and arrive immediately, then well, actually, this wouldn't cause too much damage, because the damage is already catastrophic, so one more bullet to the head of this shit show isn't going to make too much more of a mess. Additionally, why did Zack make the plot of these films revolve around food? Did he choose to make the villagers farmers, because that's what it was in Seven Samurai? Given that the King's Gaze runs on coal for some fucking reason, why not make the villagers coal miners? That way, the idea that the King's Gaze does absolutely need this resource would become infinitely more believable, provided we accept that the intergalactic planet-destroying behemoth runs on a 19th century power source. We could actually fix this almost entirely by taking inspiration from Avatar. Maybe the King's Gaze runs on fusion goo, and fusion goo is extremely rare. Maybe Velt is the only nearby planet that has fusion goo. Maybe, prior to the events of Part 1, the King's Gaze's engines were damaged in an attack by the Blood Axes, and they found themselves with no choice but to head to Velt and acquire more fusion goo. Otherwise, they are dead in the water and can neither continue their hunt for the Blood Axes, nor can they return to the Motherworld. This is not what happened, however, because this makes sense. Zack instead decided that, because this is a more mature take on Star Wars, we can't have the plot revolve around something as silly as unobtainium. Seven Samurai is, of course, a far better film than Avatar. So we just copy the thing from Seven Samurai instead, which will mean that Rebel Moon is better because it will contain more things that are good. And everyone would laugh at me if I copy something from Avatar, and because I don't give a damn about internal consistency, and because the most important thing to me is that the individual pieces are superficially cool. A mature take on Star Wars, you can't make this shit up. Additionally, he could have just removed the arbitrary resource limitation entirely and changed the setup of the film so that the King's Gaze is already looking for Kora at the start of Part 1. This would make sense, you know, most wanted fugitive in the known universe and all that. It would also mean that, instead of having Kora try to sneak out and leave the village to its fate before changing her mind, she would instead have felt responsible for what happened to Jarl Balgruuf. The reason the villagers are suffering would be because the Imperium is looking for her, rather than because the Imperium has run out of food. The total runtime of both Rebel Moon films, minus the credits, is 3 hours 56 minutes and 24 seconds. There is 26 minutes of slow motion footage in these films. There is a time and a place for slow motion. It can be used very effectively to enhance emotional moments, or simply to add to the cool factor. When you use it in every flashback and in every action scene, however, it becomes monotonous and loses its impact. Slow motion is a tool that has its place, and in the last 15 years or so, Zack seems to have forgotten what that place is. This being a Zack Snyder film, we also have religious symbolism crawling out of the goddamn walls. The crew of the King's Gaze is apparently 5,000 men, and their intention is to feed themselves with an impossibly small amount of food, which has parallels with the first of Jesus' miracles, the feeding of the 5,000, in which Jesus supposedly feeds 5,000 people using only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. Aside from this superficial similarity, however, the story of Rebel Moon has absolutely nothing to do with this particular biblical story. We also have clear religious symbolism when Admiral Noble is raised from the dead, arms outstretched in an identical manner to that of Jesus when he was crucified. Again, there is no thematic parallel between Admiral Noble and Jesus of Nazareth. One was supposedly the Son of God who died for our sins, and the other is a psychotic space Nazi. The only parallel between the two is that both rose from the dead, which I guess makes this imagery really deep and meaningful or something. We also have what appears to be something approximating a crown of thorns that is worn by Anthony Botkins. In context, this crown is in fact made of antlers, however there may be some kind of parallel we can draw, as the purpose of the crown of thorns was to cause Jesus pain and mock his perceived status as the king of the Jews, and maybe Anthony Botkins wearing a crown of thorns could be symbolic of the fact that he punishes himself for having failed to do his job, to protect the princess. I don't think we have nearly enough information in the film to conclude this, however, and I'm kind of spinning my wheels to make sense of Zack's chosen imagery. And finally, we have the true nature of Princess Issa. This one is mostly speculation, as we know virtually nothing about her, but there are clear parallels between her and Jesus Christ. Both were supposedly sent by a higher power to fix the universe, the princess by making her father stop colonizing everything he saw, and Jesus by dying for humanity's sins because God may be all-powerful, but he is nonetheless incapable of forgiveness unless the blood of the innocent is spilled in his name. Both Princess Issa and Jesus supposedly had the power to resurrect others, and both were killed only to survive via cosmic and/or spiritual magical shenanigans. Rebel Moon Part 2 is hilarious in its ineptitude. I have never seen a film with a higher percentage of fatal plot errors. And when I say fatal, I mean that if any one of these is present in your story, you have majorly fucked up and you need to rewrite your script. The universe-spanning Imperium has cracked warp travel, destroying entire planets and enslaving interdimensional energy beings, but they have not worked out how to ration their food. The food from a small farming village is considered sufficient to feed the crew of a titanic intergalactic planet-destroying vessel. No one recognizes the most wanted fugitive in the universe. The protagonists believe that the antagonists will simply forget about what happened in the previous film. The antagonists warn the protagonists that they are coming for absolutely no reason. The protagonists do not even consider abandoning the village, and the antagonists do not use the tools available to them, namely planet-destroying technology, to force Kora to cooperate. One of my major criticisms of Part 1 was that the pacing was, in a word, fucked. So how does Part 2 compare? I will give Part 2 the tiniest of gold stars. The pacing of Part 2 is not a problem at all. The problem is with the content, not the speed at which it occurs. I won't go into why the pacing of Part 1 was so awful here. If you want to see my thoughts on that, check out the video I made covering Part 1. However, I will include my chart so as to demonstrate where Part 2 has seemingly fixed this problem. I will be comparing the Rebel Moon films to the same 2 films I used in my Part 1 comparison, Star Wars Episode 4 A New Hope and Seven Samurai, as both of those films are fantastically paced. Here's the timeline for all 4 films. At the top we have Rebel Moon Part 1, below that is Part 2, below that is A New Hope, and at the bottom is Seven Samurai. As before, I have adjusted the size of these graphs to account for the differences in length and make them directly comparable. The blue parts indicate moments of downtime that are generally used for character development, world building, or advancing the plot, and the red parts indicate either short moments of intensity or lengthier fight sequences or battle sequences. Finally, this black bit in Seven Samurai is the intermission. So, unlike Part 1, Part 2, for the most part, saves its action sequences for the latter third of the film. The red sections here indicating heightened intensity are the assassination of the royal family and the backstory round table, neither of which are traditional action scenes. Additionally, the backstory round table is devoid of virtually any and all information that is relevant to the plot, and despite this scene technically containing what you could call intense or dramatic storytelling, the pacing for this 10-minute segment is glacial because of the abundance of slow motion and the fact that this sequence consists of 4 separate characters telling very similar stories. But in the interest of being as fair as I can be, I decided that as these flashbacks depict the characters experiencing very intense emotions, I would count these as moments of heightened intensity, in spite of the fact that they are entirely detached from the central narrative. If anything, then, my criticism of the pacing of the first half of Rebel Moon Part 2 is that there isn't enough drama or intensity, but I fully acknowledge that this is far, far down the list of problems with this film. Additionally, given how action-packed and intense the latter half of the film is, I can totally understand the decision to keep the first half entirely dedicated to setting up the central battle. Regarding the second half, things are more positive. The action kicks off a little earlier than in A New Hope or Seven Samurai, but the audience are given multiple breathers in amongst all the fighting. This is important because, in particular with extended battle sequences such as this, it can easily become overwhelming and monotonous if the latter half of the film was literally fight, fight, fight. So overall, my thoughts on the pacing of Rebel Moon Part 2 are broadly positive, which contrasts it with Part 1 and means that Part 2 actually does one thing right, for the most part. Now we're going to look at what Part 2 does wrong, for the most part. The characters. We are going to look at each of the main characters' overall story, taking Part 1 into account, and give conclusive statements on all of them. Because there are many characters who are utterly insignificant, and because most of these characters are defined by one single character trait, I am not going to waste your time going through all of them, and I will limit this to the central characters. Admiral Atticus Noble appears on screen for 49 minutes across both movies. He is primarily characterized by being evil. He is motivated by his desire to locate and destroy the Blood Axe rebels, but upon realizing that Kora, Arthur-Laius, is alive and within his reach, he decides to go after her in order to secure a seat in the Imperium Senate. He pretends to be a nice person, seemingly because he enjoys fucking with people rather than for any practical reason. He kills his enemies and allies for little to no reason, and he appears to only care about himself. Admiral Noble is a clearly defined character. However, he is about as one-note as is possible. As I said in Part 1, he is the stereotypical ruthless evil bad man who does ruthless evil bad things so that the goodies have something to fight against, and nothing more. The Hamburglar, or the artist formerly known as Ree, appears for 54 minutes across both movies. She lived peacefully in a village, but everything changed when the Imperium attacked. She doesn't like the Imperium because they killed her friends. Upon being rescued by Darien Bloodaxe, she fought with him for a period of time, eventually becoming a lieutenant, despite never actually participating in any battles larger than skirmishes. She likes good, doesn't like bad, and will fight to stop the bad from beating the good. That is about all I have to say about the Hamburglar. Like virtually every other character, she is hilariously simplistic, underdeveloped, and derivative. In a shocking twist of fate, Nemesis went from being the least characterized of the central characters in Part 1 to being the only character in Part 2 with any kind of functional emotional payoff. Nemesis appears for 1 hour and 4 minutes across both movies, and 95% of her characterization occurs in Part 2. Once upon a time, Nemesis lived peacefully in a village, but everything changed when the Imperium attacked. They killed everything, including Nemesis's children, at which point she took up the weapons of her ancestors so as to get her revenge. Over an unspecified period of time, Nemesis gained a reputation by assassinating 16 high-ranking officers and their security details. When we meet her, she works as a mercenary, rescues the children, and kills the bad. She tells the Spider Lady that there is a difference between justice and revenge, and after killing the Spider Lady, she claims that revenge often leads to death.
This could easily be any of you lying here in the name of revenge.
Suggesting that at some point after assassinating various high-ranking Imperium officials, Nemesis realized the folly of revenge and decided to start putting her skills to better use in the name of justice. As with many things in Rebel Moon, Nemesis's character development is implied to have taken place prior to the start of the film and is not a part of the story. Anyway, she appears to be very apathetic about killing until it is implied that she forms an emotional bond with one of the children in the village. She later becomes emotional when the villagers appear to accept her as a mother. She has found her purpose, and she later dies not in the name of revenge or justice, but to protect her new family. Nemesis is a shit character, but she is easily the best character in Rebel Moon. In the case of Nemesis, more than any of the other characters, it is pretty easy for me to see what the writers were trying to do, and to imagine how good this character had the potential to be if handled by writers who knew what they were doing. Regardless, there is very little to her, she is entirely forgettable, and her characterization is sparse to say the least. General Titus appears for 1 hour and 4 minutes across both movies, and unlike Nemesis, I have absolutely no fucking idea what the writers were trying to do with him. Titus was a general of the Imperium, and must, therefore, have done very bad things serving under Belisarius. This, like many things, is entirely ignored, however, and the fact that he refuses an order from Belisarius to fire upon a civilian city suggests that this is the first time he has been ordered to commit a war crime, despite this kind of oppressive and excessively immoral behavior being commonplace under the Imperium. After refusing to fire at civilians, he and his men fought against the Imperium before being overwhelmed. He offered to lay down his life in exchange for freedom for his men, indicating that he wanted to take the blame for his defiance, and he doesn't like other people suffering the consequences of his actions. He subsequently believed that his men died because he surrendered, which is not actually the case. They died because he refused an order to fire upon civilians. His actions on Sarawu are extremely well known, and his story has seemingly become a legend. At an unspecified point in time, Titus learned that Princess Issa was actually alive, which he must have known prior to being recruited by Kora, as he did not have the opportunity to learn this after the fact. Whether he discovered this before or after Sarawu, however, is unclear. Regardless, Titus decided to punish himself by fighting in gladiatorial combat. He has become an alcoholic, has given up, wants to die in peace, and punishes himself for his failure. And he does all of this whilst aware that the princess, the supposed savior of the universe, somehow survived her assassination attempt. This is, again, entirely ignored, and we are left wondering how Titus knew that she was alive, and what possible sequence of events could lead to him deciding not to help the princess in favor of fighting in space Rome. Anyway, Titus escapes his rut when Kora suggests, hey, so how about some revenge? Indicating that Titus had never considered the prospect of revenge until now, which is extremely funny. By the end of part 1, he is seemingly motivated by his desire to cripple and bring down the Motherworld. In part 2, we see him embrace the role of leader, and he motivates the villagers to work together. He is apparently a great military strategist, utilizing such incredible tactics as hiding behind sandbags. During all of the above, Titus has continued to drink. It is only midway through preparing the village for the upcoming battle that he decides to stop drinking alcohol and secretly begins filling his bottle with water. Titus's alcoholism doesn't actually prompt any kind of change in his behavior, and so I have no idea why the writers maintained this character trait after his opening scene. The only purpose this serves is that it allows Kora to evade his questioning about her past, by having her inform the others that Titus is no longer an alcoholic. Titus should have been a very simple character, but ended up being a complete mess. There are massive gaps in his past that seemingly cannot be filled in any coherent manner, and his broad characterization, like most of the other characters, is hero man who fights bad. Tarak appears for 1 hour and 20 minutes across both movies, and I have very little to say about him. Tarak lived peacefully in a city, but everything changed when the Imperium attacked. His planet was invaded, and he didn't stay to protect his mother, and fled to preserve his bloodline, in spite of the fact that he could have saved his mother and preserved his bloodline. He then did a bunch of stuff that is never mentioned or implied in either film, and when we meet him in part 1, he is working as a blacksmith for a rancher he owes money to, and he is compelled to do so because he honors his debts. He is really good at riding hippogriffs and appears to care about animals, despite leaving animals in the hands of obviously bad people. He knows a thing or two about the guilt of carrying on when those he has sworn to fight with are gone, which is not a part of his backstory, and so I can only assume that the actor read a line intended for Titus by accident. He never thought he'd die fighting side by side with a Hamburglar, but accepts that if he must die, he will die side by side with a friend. Tarak is not worth another word in this analysis. Gunnar appears for 1 hour and 42 minutes across both movies. Gunnar lived peacefully in a village, but everything changed when the Imperium attacked. Gunnar goes from a naive farmer who fancies Kora to a naive farmer who successfully sexes Kora and then dies because Kora didn't wear her disguise whilst undercover on an enemy ship. You could absolutely say that Gunnar is punished for thinking with his dick. As he is informed that his fuck buddy is also a child murderer, he doesn't seem to care about this revelation. He goes on a mission to help his child murdering fuck buddy, only to die as a result. This is thematically coherent, as the writers are portraying the consequences of being blinded by a lady's tuna taco. However, there is no way in hell that this is what the writers wanted to do with this character. Anyway, Gunnar receives virtually no character development in Part 2 beyond loves Kora and dead, so let's move on to Kora.
Sophia was she a super obvious choice? For me, she was. She obviously, I think dramatically for me, really nailed what I was looking for from what Kora is. Just she has a sort of dark history. She's on a redemptive journey. She needs to be vulnerable, but tough. It's tough. It's a complicated part.
Kora is a hilarious mess of a protagonist. Across both films, she appears for a staggering 2 hours and 18 minutes, making her the character with the highest amount of total screen time in any media I have ever covered, beating out Vi in Arcane, Bilbo in The Hobbit, and Galadriel in Rings of Power. Kora lived peacefully in a village, but everything changed when the Imperium attacked. Her people and family were slaughtered, and she encountered Belisarius alone in an alleyway. He allowed her to try and kill him, and she only failed because the gun didn't work, which demonstrated to him that she had the ability, even as a child, to take a life, which impressed Belisarius. Figuring that he might need someone with these skills later down the line, he adopted her, and she was trained for 5 years in the ways of the Motherworld, and learned from Belisarius as his student and as his daughter, becoming fully integrated into Imperium military culture. She fought for the king of distant worlds under the banner of a people who murdered her entire family and destroyed her world.
They had trained me, broken me, and rebuilt me in their image.
Which seems to be an attempt to remove any kind of blame for any of her actions, but that is unfortunately not how this works. Anyway, all of this from the start was part of a master plan by Belisarius. He adopted Kora, trained her, and positioned her as the single bodyguard of the royal family, so as to later pin the assassination on her. Kora then went through with the assassination as planned, despite claiming to believe that the princess would be the dawn of something better. She murdered Issa because she believed that Belisarius would protect her from the consequences of doing so. She believed that she was working with Belisarius, and that she would play a part in his subsequent Imperium. Only after realizing that he was going to pin the whole thing on her did she flee and realize that actually, wasting little girls isn't nice. She subsequently escaped to Velt and crash-landed on a ship that was not damaged in any way, and seemingly became dedicated to her new life as a farmer. She engages in casual sex with Den, which is informed by her reluctance to form emotional attachments, as she fell in love with a fellow soldier who died in battle previously and subsequently believed herself to be incapable of love. After the grasshoppers arrive and demand grain, Kora tries to run away from her new home, believing that the villagers will all be killed by the Imperium. She does not attempt to convince any of the others to run because she does not want to reveal her identity, which indicates that she doesn't particularly care about anyone else in the village. She states that she doesn't want to inspire the villagers to fight back, as she believes that they will die if they do so. She doesn't want the blood on her hands, despite the fact that she believes they will die regardless of what she does. Or, in other words, she doesn't want the inconvenience of feeling guilty. However, she is reminded of how bad the Imperium is when they try and rape the villagers, and decides at this point to locate and recruit General Titus. She successfully recruits a team of action figures, defeats Noble and the Dreadnought, and is apparently going to continue fighting and locate the princess so as to redeem herself. Now then, conclusion time. Kora is a piece of shit who was forced out of the Imperium by Belisarius. She didn't run away because what she did was wrong, she ran away because she was going to be punished. She facilitated the assassination of the royal family. She could have warned them, but chose not to. She personally murdered a child and then hid on Velt. The fact that the princess survived this is irrelevant. This may matter in terms of the Imperium and the world and the prophecy and bringing balance to the Force or whatever the fuck was mentioned that one time, but this does not matter in terms of what Kora has actually done. Shooting a girl with the intent to kill and finding out that the girl survived through magical means or otherwise does not mean that you did not intend to kill. The only difference between murder and attempted murder is that the target survived. Kora still went through the motions, and so, morally speaking, Kora is a child murderer. I have absolutely no idea what the writers were thinking with this character. She is incredibly morally confused and very much reminds me of Galadriel from Rings of Power. She is treated like a superhero in that the world and characters react to her as if she can do no wrong, but when you look at the specifics of what she actually does, Kora should absolutely be strung up before Belisarius as punishment for her crimes. The fact that Belisarius is worse than Kora does not mean that Kora is a good person. You don't get to have your protagonist spend 3 hours moping about how guilty they feel about something vague that happened that one time, and then reveal that this character is personally responsible for the murder of a child and was an accomplice in the murder of the king and queen. This is not the same as, for example, General Titus, because his guilt apparently stems from the fact that his fellow soldiers died because of his own refusal to do what Belisarius told him to do. In the case of Kora, her guilt stems from the fact that she did exactly what Belisarius told her to do. And yet, no one seems to be aware of this. And my final question regarding Kora, why is she known as the Scargiver? What part of her backstory earned her this name? Was it because she scarred the Imperium? Or was it because she blew a hole through a child? I will leave that up to you. In conclusion, every character in Rebel Moon is a joke, not dissimilar to Katana from Suicide Squad.
This is Katana. She can cut all you in half with one sword stroke, just like mowing the lawn. I would advise not getting killed by her. Her sword traps the souls of its victims.
Why does she do that? How does she do that? Who is she? Why is she helping? It doesn't matter. She traps the souls of her victims. That's sufficient characterization, right? Besides, it's probably in a comic somewhere, which means the filmmakers don't actually have to put the work in because they can rely on fans to defend their shitty movie by claiming that someone else explained this character in a marginally less shitty work. The difference between Rebel Moon and Suicide Squad is that Suicide Squad, as bad as it is, does have characters and does have characterization. These characters are by no means well characterized, but they are at least characterized in some way. The reason why Katana sticks out specifically and is frequently used as meme fodder is because she is even worse than the others, and receives even less in the way of characterization. Imagine if every character in Suicide Squad was Katana, and you get something approximating Rebel Moon. Rebel Moon Part 2 takes everything that was piss about Part 1 and dials it up to 11. It expects us to believe that it is easier to train villagers how to use guns than it is to train soldiers how to plant crops. It expects us to accept that a village of medieval peasants might possibly stand a slim chance against a highly militaristic intergalactic superpower. It expects us to accept that such a large faction would be so desperate for food that they burn considerable resources to travel to and extort these peasants so as to take their food. It expects us to accept that when the commander of a starship is killed, the starship will immediately abandon its mission and return home, even if there is not enough food on board to sustain the crew. It expects us to believe that the Imperium simply going home and forgetting what happened in Part 1 is not a hilariously ridiculous suggestion. The only character with an arc in Part 1 is killed off in Part 2, and the only character with an emotional payoff is also killed in Part 2. Part 1 at least had Kai, who was relatively charismatic thanks almost entirely to Charlie Hunnam, and Kai is not in Part 2. This movie is void of charisma. There are no characters that do anything other than read the lines when the director says action. Zack thinks he's going to get another Rebel Moon film, or 4, and let me say that I hope he does, because Rebel Moon Parts 1 and 2 are a hilarious example of what a movie should not be. They are a near absolute failure, and I don't care what kinds of numbers Netflix are claiming, because there is no barrier to entry for watching a film in your lounge like there is for going to the cinema, and these numbers also don't account for autoplay, people falling asleep, and people not watching the whole film. And to be honest, I don't care how successful Rebel Moon is on Netflix. I care how good it is. The number of redeemable qualities to Rebel Moon I can count on one fucking finger. Rebel Moon is a fascinating exercise in how not to tell a story. It is an exercise in how not to explore characters. It is an exercise in how not to deliver exposition to the audience. But who knows, maybe the 4-hour black and white Snyder cut of Rebel Moon will fix all of the fundamental problems with the storytelling and characters in these films. Maybe it is unfair of me to be talking about the theatrical cuts in inverted commas, because these films were of course not released theatrically, and therefore Zack will have had none of the same limitations imposed on most filmmakers. The only reason there is going to be a director's cut is to milk extra viewing hours on Netflix from the brainlets who eat this shit up. The whole point of a director's cut is to allow the director of a particular film a chance to recut their movie in such a way as they were prohibited from doing so when the film was originally theatrically released. Peter Jackson was not able to release the extended cuts for The Lord of the Rings theatrically because, primarily, they were too long. The studio said no. Ridley Scott and James Cameron encountered similar issues and were able to remedy them with varying degrees of effectiveness in the case of Aliens, The Abyss, Blade Runner, and Kingdom of Heaven.
I'd written the script, of course, in a vacuum, just as I would, with my normal sort of aesthetic. It's a very hard R, very like sexy, violent, crazy, everything's all at 11. And I think what happened in my conversation with Netflix, they were always like, would there be any way to like go back to your original sort of subversive R-rated version? I was like, yeah, that'd be great. And they go, then we could have like, you could do your thing and we could have that as a separate piece of content.
In the case of Zack Snyder and Rebel Moon, however, either Zack or Netflix has decided that, to capitalize on the fact that he previously released an extended cut of Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice, as well as Zack Snyder's Justice League, which was a fundamentally different film to the original cut, and the fact that in both cases these films were R-rated re-edits of originally PG-13 rated movies, Zack will also create an R-rated director's cut of both Rebel Moon movies, adding approximately an hour of footage to each. The original script for Rebel Moon, back when it was going to be one single film, was 172 pages, which approximately equates to 3 hours of runtime. Zack was told by Netflix chairman Scott Stuber that under 2-hour movies really do better for some reason, to which Zack responded, "If you ask me to make this less than 2 hours, I'm going to lose all the character. You won't care about these people. What if I give you 2 movies?" Which is why we ended up with 2 films instead of 1. Setting aside the hilarious proposition that Rebel Moon contains characters that the audience cares about, this means that Zack's original script was 3 hours long. In splitting his script into 2 movies, it has become 4 hours long, and the total runtime of the Zack Snyder Super Duper Ultimate Director's Special Edition cut will be 6 hours long. Which means that Zack has somehow found a way to not only bloat a 3-hour story into a 6-hour story, but he has found a way to convince his fans that this 6-hour story will be better than the original version. And I am left wondering why. The problems with Rebel Moon are fundamental. There are world-building contradictions that are so blatant that a moderately intelligent plate of spaghetti would notice them. The characters are unbelievably bare bones and are, for the most part, about as well characterized as a piece of furniture. The plot makes total sense, provided you ignore all of the context and forget what happens in each prior scene. The acting ranges from okay to terrible. The visuals range from okay to I can't tell how good this is because everything is so oversaturated and out of focus. The Snyder cut will be better, however, because we will get to see Noble's head get cut off in gory slow motion. Nemesis will dismember the soldiers in fountains of blood, and Kora will remove chunks of flesh from the doctors as they scream and plead for mercy. Because honestly, the main problem with Rebel Moon is that there just isn't enough blood. I really like seeing blood in movies because it makes me feel like I'm wearing my big boy pants. I can pretend as though I am watching an adult movie with adult themes and adult characters. A more mature take on Star Wars, dare I say. And in that sense, I have no doubt that the Snyder cut of Rebel Moon will be a far more mature take on Star Wars because there will be more blood. And who knows, maybe the characters might say a no-no word.
I will fucking kill you. Who's gonna give you a reach around?
You don't see that in Star Wars, because Star Wars is for children, don't you know? It isn't high art like Zack Snyder's Rebel Moon. Anyway, in conclusion, Rebel Moon Part 2 is in fact so bad that I was very tempted to break from tradition and name this video something other than Rebel Moon Part 2 is also not very good. It is so bad that I struggle to conceive of a way for it to be worse. I cannot comprehend how someone could possibly praise this film beyond saying it looks cool, or some of the actors were trying, or at least it's not Marvel. I am not a Marvel fan. I've had no interest in Marvel since 2019. I have, however, seen every Marvel film released since then because I am often able to find enjoyment in watching terrible movies. I would say the absolute worst of the worst when it comes to Marvel are Ant-Man Quantumania, Doctor Strange Multiverse of Madness, The Eternals, Black Widow, and The Marvels. Zack Snyder's Rebel Moon Part 2, The Scargiver, is worse than any film Marvel has ever released. It is the worst piece of media I have had the displeasure of analysing. I feel less intelligent after having watched it. Staring at a blank fucking canvas now brings me joy, because I can be safe in the knowledge that whatever artistic message is conveyed through fucking nothing can't possibly be worse than Zack Snyder's Rebel Moon Part 2, The Scargiver. This is, without exaggeration, one of the worst movies I have ever seen. And the only things I have to praise are a few seconds of characterization for Nemesis and a couple of ideas that are not explored with Anthony Botkins. Do not waste your time with this movie unless you want to become depressed at the knowledge that some people do actually enjoy this fecal discharge. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you have enjoyed the video. If you did and you would like to see more, please consider liking, sharing, or subscribing. I do also like to gauge interest in potential future videos, so if you want to see me cover something in particular, let me know in the comments. Feel free to check out the second channel and jump in the community Discord. Links for both are in the description. Thank you again so much for watching, and I will see you in my next video.